They called it a marriage of survival. A white schoolteacher with nowhere left to turn, and an Apache horseman the town refused to trust, standing before a circuit judge who could barely hide his disgust. Clara Whitmore signed her name beside Talon Greyhawk's, not because she loved him, but because the bank was 3 days from seizing everything she had left of her father's dream. He offered his name like a shield, cold and impenetrable, asking nothing in return but silence. Neither of them expected what would grow in that silence. Something dangerous, something neither could name, something that would cost them everything before it saved them. But when jealousy, old ghosts, and pride finally tore them apart, Clara would walk away carrying more than just heartbreak. She would carry his child, alone, into a winter that showed no mercy to women who dared survive without a man's protection. If you want to see how far love can fall before it finds solid ground again, stay with me until the end. And when you do, drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story can travel across the miles between us. The red dust of the Arizona territory settled over everything like a stain that wouldn't wash clean, over the crooked wooden storefronts of Red Mesa, over the horses tied outside the saloon, over the dreams people carried west and buried when reality proved harder than hope. Clara Whitmore stood on the sagging porch of her father's old schoolhouse, watching the dust devils spin across the empty yard where children used to play, and felt the weight of every impossible choice pressing down on her shoulders. 3 months since her father died. 3 months since the consumption took him in the night, leaving her with nothing but a teaching certificate the town council refused to honor, a plot of land she couldn't farm alone, and debts that multiplied like locusts. The bank letter crinkled in her apron pocket, sharp-edged and final. 30 days to settle accounts or forfeit all holdings to auction. She was 24 years old, university-educated, and completely out of options. Miss Whitmore. The voice came from the bottom of the steps, low and careful, shaped around English words like they were stones he was learning to stack. We need to talk. Clara turned and found Talon Greyhawk watching her with eyes the color of winter smoke. He stood with the stillness of someone who'd learned early that sudden movements drew bullets, his dark hair tied back with a strip of leather, his shirt patched but clean. Half the town crossed the street when they saw him coming. The other half pretended not to see him at all. She'd spoken to him exactly twice before this moment. Once when he'd brought a Paiute boy with a broken arm to her father for help, and once when he'd stopped 3 drunk ranch hands from following her home after dark. Both times he'd used fewer than 10 words total. Mr. Greyhawk. She kept her voice steady, though her heart was already racing with something that might have been hope or might have been fear. What can I do for you? He climbed the steps slowly, each boot heel a measured strike against rotting wood. Up close she could see the scar that ran from his left temple into his hairline, the way his knuckles were scarred from fights he probably hadn't started but definitely finished. He stopped 3 feet away, respecting a distance she hadn't asked for but somehow needed. I heard about the bank, he said. About what they're planning. Heat rushed to her face. The whole town's heard, I expect. Makes for good entertainment over Sunday dinner. Some people find joy in other people's suffering. His expression didn't change, but something in his tone suggested he knew that truth from the receiving end. I'm not one of them. That's very kind, Mr. Greyhawk, but I don't see how— I have a solution, he interrupted, then paused like he was considering whether to say the next part at all. If you're willing to hear it. Clara folded her arms, suddenly aware of how alone they were, how the nearest neighbor was half a mile down a road that turned to mud when it rained. I'm listening. Marry me. The words landed between them like a rock thrown through glass, sharp, shocking, impossible to ignore. Clara stared at him, certain she'd misheard, but his face remained impassive, waiting. I beg your pardon? The law won't let a woman hold land alone, Talon said, as if he were explaining basic arithmetic. But it'll respect a husband's claim. You marry me, the property becomes mine on paper, and the bank has no grounds to seize it. You keep the school, keep the house, keep everything your father built. Nothing changes except the name on the deed. Nothing changes? Clara's laugh came out too high, too sharp. Mr. Greyhawk, marriage is not a business transaction. In town it is. His gaze held hers, unflinching. Half the women here married for land, or water rights, or because their families needed one less mouth to feed. At least I'm being honest about the terms. She wanted to argue, wanted to explain that she'd always imagined marriage differently, Love, partnership, the kind of devotion her parents had shared before her mother died, bringing her into the world. But standing there with dust coating her shoes and debt suffocating her future, those dreams felt like luxuries she could no longer afford. "Why would you do this?" she asked quietly. "What do you get out of it?" For the first time, something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but a softening around his eyes that suggested he'd been waiting for that exact question. "I get a legal claim to land the town can't take from me because of my blood," he said. "I get a foothold they can't burn down or run off when they get tired of seeing my face. And you get to keep what's yours. We both win, Miss Whitmore. That's all it needs to be." Clara turned away, gripping the porch railing hard enough to feel splinters press against her palms. In the distance, she could see the banker's house, 2 stories of whitewashed prosperity built on the backs of people who couldn't pay their debts. She thought about standing in that man's office while he explained, with false sympathy, that the law was the law and sentiment wouldn't save her land. She thought about losing the last piece of her father she had left. "I need time to think," she said. "You have 3 days," Talon replied. "After that, the bank makes its move. If you decide yes, meet me at the courthouse at noon on Friday. If you decide no, I'll respect that and will never speak of this again." He descended the steps without waiting for a response, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd learned to take up as little space as possible. Clara watched him cross the yard and disappear down the road, his shadow stretching long in the failing light. That night, she sat at her father's desk and made a list of every other option she could think of. By dawn, she'd crossed them all out. Friday came too fast and too slow, the way important days always do. Clara wore her mother's dress, cream-colored linen with pearl buttons, carefully preserved and smelling faintly of cedar. She braided her hair and pinned it up, looked at her reflection in the cloudy mirror, and barely recognized the woman staring back. "This is practical," she told herself. "This is survival." But her hand shook as she gathered her father's land deed and marriage certificate, and she had to sit down twice on the walk to town because her legs suddenly didn't want to support her weight. The courthouse was a squat adobe building that served as courtroom, land office, and occasional jail depending on what the town needed that week. Talon was already waiting on the steps, dressed in dark trousers and a clean shirt that looked brand new. His hair was loose around his shoulders, black and straight and longer than most white men would have dared to wear it in a place like Red Mesa. He stood when he saw her coming. "Miss Whitmore?" "Mr. Greyhawk." They regarded each other like 2 people standing on opposite sides of a river, both knowing someone had to step into the current first. "You're sure about this?" he asked. She wanted to say no. She wanted to run. Instead, she nodded. "Then let's get it done." The circuit judge was a florid man named Horace Pendleton, who made no effort to hide his disgust when they stated their intention. He looked from Clara to Talon and back again, his jowls quivering with disapproval. "You understand what you're doing, Miss Whitmore?" he asked, ignoring Talon completely. "This is a legal and binding contract. Once signed, it cannot be easily undone." "I understand perfectly, Judge Pendleton. And you're entering this marriage of your own free will? He hasn't—" Pendleton's gaze cut to Talon with naked hostility. "Coerced you in any way?" "No one has coerced me," Clara said, her voice sharper than she intended. "I'm here because I choose to be." Pendleton sniffed like he smelled something rotten. "Very well. Raise your right hands." The ceremony lasted less than 5 minutes. There were no guests, no flowers, no music. Just words spoken in a dusty room that smelled of old paper and older prejudice, and 2 signatures on a document that would tie them together whether they wanted it or not. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Arizona, I now pronounce you man and wife," Pendleton said, his tone suggesting he'd rather be pronouncing a death sentence. "You may, well, you're married. God help you both." He thrust the certificate at Clara, like he couldn't bear to touch it any longer than necessary, and turned away, already calling for his clerk to bring the next case. Outside, the sun was bright enough to hurt. Clara stood on the courthouse steps holding a piece of paper that declared her Mrs. Talon Greyhawk, and felt like she'd just signed away something she couldn't name and would never get back. "What happens now?" she asked. Talon looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Now we go home," he said. "I'll move my things to the barn. You keep the house. We live separate, respectful, and quiet. The town gets used to seeing us together. In 6 months or a year, when the gossip dies down, we can reassess. Reassess? Decide if you want to make it permanent or file for dissolution. He said it like he was discussing crop rotation. Either way, the land stays protected. Clara wanted to ask what happened if feelings got involved, if proximity bred something more complicated than convenience, but the question felt too dangerous to speak aloud. Instead, she just nodded. "All right," she said. "Let's go home. It's out." The first week passed in a blur of awkward silences and careful distance. Talon moved his bedroll and few possessions into the barn without comment, refused Clara's offer of the spare room, and set about repairing everything on the property that her father's illness had left neglected. He fixed the fence line, cleared the irrigation ditch, patched the roof where winter had torn shingles loose. He worked from first light until dark, and at dusk he'd knock on the kitchen door and Clara would bring him dinner on a tin plate. They rarely spoke more than necessary. "Fence is done." "Thank you." "Roof needs more work. I'll get to it tomorrow." "I appreciate it." "Coffee's good." "I'm glad you think so." It was a strange kind of loneliness, Clara discovered. Being married, but alone. Sharing space with someone who felt more like a ghost than a husband. She taught her small class of students during the day, cooked simple meals in the evening, and lay awake at night listening to the distant sounds of Talon moving around in the barn, wondering what he thought about in the darkness, whether he regretted this arrangement as much as she sometimes did. But she couldn't deny that his presence changed things. The ranch hands who used to make crude comments when she walked to the mercantile now tipped their hats and looked away. The banker who'd sent those threatening letters now greeted her with forced politeness. Even Mrs. Crenshaw, the minister's wife, who'd led the campaign to deny Clara her teaching position, went quiet when Clara walked past. Being Mrs. Greyhawk came with a kind of armor Clara hadn't expected. Not because the town respected Talon, but because they feared him just enough to leave his wife alone. The second week, things shifted. Clara was carrying water from the well when her grip slipped and the bucket crashed to the ground, soaking her skirt and bruising her shin badly enough to make her gasp. She sat down hard in the mud, frustrated tears stinging her eyes, hating how weak she felt, how incapable. "Let me." She looked up to find Talon standing over her, his hand extended. She hesitated, then took it. His grip was calloused and warm, and he pulled her to her feet with effortless strength. "You all right?" he asked. "I'm fine. Just clumsy." He looked at her shin, which was already turning purple, then at the spilled water darkening the dirt. Without a word, he picked up the bucket and headed back to the well. "You don't have to." "I know," he said over his shoulder. "Sit down. I'll bring it to the house." She watched him work the pump, his shoulders moving beneath his shirt, and felt something uncomfortable twist in her chest. Gratitude, maybe. Or something more dangerous. That night, he knocked on the door earlier than usual. When Clara answered, he was holding a bundle of something wrapped in cloth. "What's this?" "Arnica," he said, for bruises. "My mother used to make it. It'll help with the swelling." Clara took the bundle, surprised by the gesture and unsure how to respond. "Thank you, Talon. That's very kind." His name felt strange in her mouth, intimate in a way that scared her. But he didn't seem to notice. He just nodded and turned to go. "Talon?" He paused. Would you like to eat inside tonight? It's getting cold out there in the barn." For a moment he didn't move. Then, slowly, he turned back. "You sure?" "I'm sure." That night they sat across from each other at her father's old table and ate rabbit stew in a silence that felt less empty than before. Clara watched the lamplight catch in Talon's dark eyes and wondered what her father would have thought of this arrangement, whether he would have been ashamed or simply grateful that she'd survived. "Tell me about your mother," she said suddenly, surprising herself. Talon looked up, his spoon halfway to his mouth. "Why?" "Because we're married," Clara said, "and I don't know anything about you." He set down the spoon carefully. "Not much to tell." "I doubt that's true." He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then finally, "She was Apache, born in the Chiricahua Mountains before the soldiers came. She married my father, a trapper from St. Louis, against her family's wishes. They said he'd leave her when things got hard. They were right." "I'm sorry." Talon shrugged. She taught me to track, to survive, to understand two worlds even though neither one wanted me. Then fever took her when I was 12. After that, I learned to stop expecting people to stay. The words settled between them, heavy with old grief. Clara thought about her own losses, her mother, her father, every certainty she'd once held about how life was supposed to unfold. I understand that, she said quietly, about not expecting people to stay. His gaze met hers across the table, and for just a moment, the careful distance they'd maintained cracked open enough to let something real slip through. Then we understand each other, he said. Talk. The days began to find a rhythm. Talon worked the land with the kind of knowledge Clara lacked, knowing when to plant, when to harvest, how to coax life from soil that looked dead. Clara taught her students and kept the house, and in the evenings they'd sit together in the kitchen, sometimes talking, sometimes just existing in the same space without needing to fill it with words. She learned that he liked his coffee strong and his silence undisturbed in the mornings, that he had a dry sense of humor he rarely showed but that surfaced in unexpected moments, that he was fluent in 3 languages, English, Spanish, and Hindi, the Apache tongue, and that he read books when he thought no one was watching, his finger tracing the words like they were something precious. He learned that she sang when she cooked, usually old ballads her mother had taught her, that she was stubborn about accepting help but grateful when it came anyway, that she'd wanted to be a doctor before the world made it clear that dream belonged to men. So she'd settled for teaching and tried not to resent the compromise. They learned each other like languages neither had planned to speak. One evening in late autumn, Clara was mending a tear in Talon's shirt when she looked up and found him watching her with an expression she couldn't read. "What?" she asked. "Nothing," he said, but something in his voice had changed, gone softer, more uncertain. "It's just, you didn't have to do that." "I know, but it needed doing, and I know how to do it, so—" She shrugged, trying to ignore the way her pulse had quickened. "It's not a burden, Talon." He was quiet for a moment, then, "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Someone who'd regret this, who'd look at me like everyone else does, like something dangerous they're forced to tolerate." Clara set down the mending and met his gaze directly. "You're not dangerous to me. How do you know?" "Because dangerous men don't fix roofs for free, or bring medicine for bruises, or read poetry when they think no one's watching." Talon's eyes widened slightly. "You knew about that?" "I see more than you think." She smiled, just a little. "You're a good man, Talon Greyhawk. I wish you'd believe that." Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or hope, or something too fragile to name. He opened his mouth like he wanted to say something, but before he could, a sharp knock rattled the front door. Clara frowned. Who would come calling this late? Talon was already on his feet, his hand moving instinctively to the knife at his belt. "Stay here." He crossed to the door and opened it to reveal a woman standing in the spill of lamplight, tall, dark-haired, dressed in riding clothes that had seen hard miles. She looked at Talon with eyes that held history and hurt in equal measure. "Hello, Talon," she said. "Did you miss me?" Clara felt her stomach drop even before Talon spoke. "Celine," he said, and the way he said it, careful, wary, weighted with things Clara didn't understand, told her everything she needed to know. The past had just arrived on their doorstep, and nothing would be the same after this. Celine Vance was beautiful in a way that made Clara feel plain and insignificant. Sharp cheekbones, dark eyes that missed nothing. The kind of confidence that came from surviving things most people only whispered about. She stepped into the house without waiting for an invitation, her gaze sweeping across the room before landing on Clara. "So this is the wife," Celine said, her tone caught somewhere between amusement and contempt. "She's not what I pictured." "Celine." Talon's voice held a warning. "Why are you here? Can't a woman visit an old friend? We're not friends." "No?" Celine's smile was sharp as broken glass. "That's not how I remember it." Clara stood, her hands clenched in her skirt, feeling like an intruder in her own home. Don't," Talon said, not looking at her. "You live here. You stay." But Celine was already moving closer to him, her hand reaching out to touch his arm with a familiarity that made Clara's chest tight. "We need to talk, Tal. Alone. About Nevada." "There's nothing to talk about." "Isn't there?" Celine's gaze flicked to Clara, assessing, dismissing. Or does your little arrangement here change what we both know is true? Get out. Talon's voice was flat, final. Now. I'm staying at the boarding house, Celine said, unfazed. When you're ready to be honest, with yourself and with me, you know where to find me. She left as abruptly as she'd arrived, the door clicking shut behind her like a period ending a sentence that would never be finished. Talon stood frozen, his jaw tight, his hands clenched at his sides. Clara wanted to ask 1,000 questions. Instead, she asked the only one that mattered. Who was she? Someone I used to know, Talon said, still not looking at her. A long time ago. She seems to think it was more than that. Finally he turned, and Clara saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before. Vulnerability, raw and unguarded. It was complicated. Are you in love with her? The question hung between them like smoke. Talon's expression shuddered, closing her out, and Clara knew she'd made a mistake, pushed too hard, asked for something he hadn't agreed to give. This arrangement was never about love, he said quietly. You know that. Yes, Clara whispered, feeling something crack inside her chest. I know that. But somewhere along the way she'd forgotten. Somewhere between shared dinners and mended shirts and the way he looked at her sometimes like she was something worth protecting, she'd let herself imagine this could become real. Celine's arrival was a harsh reminder that it never was. That night, Clara lay awake and listened to Talon pacing in the barn, back and forth, like a caged thing searching for an escape that didn't exist. And for the first time since she'd signed her name beside his, she wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. The next 3 weeks unraveled everything they'd carefully built. Celine didn't leave town. Instead, she made herself impossible to ignore, appearing at the mercantile when Clara shopped, riding past the schoolhouse when Clara taught, always dressed impeccably and always watching with those knowing eyes. The town, starved for scandal, devoured every moment of it. I heard she and Greyhawk were lovers in Nevada, Mrs. Crenshaw said loudly enough for Clara to hear, before he came here and tricked that poor Whitmore girl into marriage. Clara kept her head high and her face blank, but the words burrowed under her skin like splinters. Talon grew distant again, retreating into the silence that had marked their first days together. He still worked the land, still brought her water and fixed what needed fixing, but the dinners stopped. The conversations ended. He became a ghost again, and Clara felt the loss like a physical ache. One afternoon, she saw Talon and Celine talking outside the livery. She couldn't hear their words, but she saw the way Celine touched his shoulder, the way Talon didn't pull away. Jealousy rose in Clara's throat, bitter and choking, and she turned away before either of them could see her watching. That night, she burned the stew and cried over the ruined pot, hating herself for caring, hating Celine for returning, hating Talon for not fighting whatever was happening between them. And then, a week later, everything shattered completely. Clara was walking back from the schoolhouse when she saw Talon at the edge of town, talking to a man she didn't recognize, tall, well-dressed, with the kind of easy smile that set her teeth on edge. They were standing too close, speaking in low tones that suggested intimacy, and when the man touched Talon's arm, Talon didn't move away. Clara's vision blurred. She told herself it meant nothing, that she was reading too much into an innocent conversation, but the doubt Celine had planted took root and grew wild. This arrangement was never about love. Talon's words echoed in her head. Maybe she'd been a fool to think it could ever become something more. That evening, Talon came to the house earlier than usual. Clara was sitting at the table, hands folded, face carefully composed. "We need to talk," she said before he could speak. He paused in the doorway, something wary in his expression. "All right. I think we should end this." The words landed hard, final. Talon went very still. "End what?" "The marriage, the arrangement, all of it." Clara kept her voice steady, refusing to let him see how much it cost her. "You've kept your end of the bargain. The land is protected. The bank can't touch it. We can file for dissolution quietly. No one has to know why." "Clara, don't." She held up a hand, stopping him. "Please don't make this harder than it needs to be. I see the way you look at her. I see the way she looks at you. And I saw you today with that man, and I can't do this anymore. I can't live in a marriage that was never meant to be real while watching you wish you were somewhere else." Talon's face had gone blank, unreadable. What man? The one you were talking to this afternoon, by the livery. That was. He stopped, shook his head. Doesn't matter. If you want out, I won't stop you. The ease with which he agreed felt like a knife sliding between her ribs. Clara had hoped, she hated that she'd hoped, that he might fight for this. That he might say the things growing between them mattered, that Celine didn't. That whatever she'd seen didn't mean what she thought it meant. But he didn't. I'll draw up the papers, she said. You can sign them whenever you're ready. Talon nodded once, sharp and final, then turned and walked out. Clara listened to his footsteps fade into the night and let herself break apart in the silence he left behind. The next morning, she found the barn empty. Talon's bedroll was gone, his few possessions vanished. The only thing he'd left behind was a single piece of paper on the kitchen table, weighted down with a smooth river stone. Clara unfolded it with shaking hands and found his signature, dark and decisive, next to the line marked Husband's Consent to Dissolution. He'd signed the divorce papers without hesitation and disappeared before dawn. Clara sat down hard, the paper crumpling in her grip, and tried to remember how to breathe around the pain crushing her chest. She'd wanted him to fight for her. Instead, he'd walked away without a word, and she was alone again. Exactly the way she'd started. But there was one thing she didn't know yet, one secret her body was keeping that would change everything. 2 weeks later, when the nausea started and wouldn't stop, when her courses failed to come and her dresses grew tight across her middle, Clara finally understood the full weight of what she'd lost. She was carrying Talon Greyhawk's child, and he was gone. The morning sickness hit Clara like a physical blow, sudden, brutal, impossible to ignore. She barely made it to the basin before her stomach emptied itself, leaving her gasping and shaking on the cold kitchen floor. Outside, the first snow of the season was falling in soft, relentless sheets, and she watched it through the window while her body rebelled against the secret it could no longer hide. She was 8 weeks along, maybe 9. The timing lined up too perfectly with the last night Talon had come to the house for dinner, the night before Celine arrived and everything shattered. Clara pressed her hand against her still flat stomach and felt terror and wonder collide somewhere deep in her chest. A baby. Talon's baby. Growing inside her while he was gone to wherever men went when they ran from things they didn't want to face. She'd tried to find him in those first desperate weeks after he left, asked at the livery, the saloon, the boarding house where Celine had stayed. But Celine was gone too, and the story that spread through Red Mesa like wildfire was exactly what Clara had feared. Talon Greyhawk had abandoned his white wife and run off with the woman he'd really loved all along. The town ate it up with vicious satisfaction, and Clara learned to walk past the whispers with her head high and her face blank, even when every word felt like a stone thrown at her back. Now, staring at her reflection in the cloudy mirror, she saw a woman who'd made a catastrophic mistake. Not in marrying Talon. She couldn't bring herself to regret that. Not when every shared dinner and mended shirt and quiet conversation had felt more real than anything else in her life. No. Her mistake was in believing she could control what her heart did in the silence between them, in thinking she could protect herself from falling for a man who'd never promised her anything but his name. She'd fallen anyway, hard and completely, and now she was paying the price. The nausea passed, leaving her weak and dizzy. Clara cleaned herself up, braided her hair with trembling fingers, and forced herself to eat a piece of dry bread that tasted like ash in her mouth. Then she pulled on her heaviest shawl and walked through the snow to the only person in Red Mesa who might help her without judgment. Doc Merritt was 70, if he was a day, with gentle hands and eyes that had seen every kind of human suffering the frontier could devise. He'd been the one to sit with Clara's father at the end, to ease his passage with morphine and quiet words, and he'd never once mentioned payment for services he knew she couldn't afford. When Clara knocked on his door that morning, he took one look at her face and ushered her inside without a word. "Sit down before you fall down," he said, pulling out a chair by his fire. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Worse," Clara whispered. "I've seen my future, and I don't know how to survive it." He examined her with professional efficiency, checking her pulse, her eyes, the pallor of her skin, and when he asked her to describe her symptoms, she told him everything. The nausea, the missed courses, the exhaustion that made every simple task feel impossible. He listened without interrupting, his weathered face giving nothing away. Finally, he sat back and looked at her with something like sympathy. "You're pregnant," he said. "About 2 months, I'd wager. Healthy, from what I can tell, but you're going to need to start eating better and resting more. A woman in your condition can't afford to run herself ragged." Clara closed her eyes, hearing the words make it real in a way her own suspicions hadn't. "Can you help me?" she asked quietly. "Help you how?" She met his gaze, knowing he'd understand what she couldn't quite say aloud. There were remedies, dangerous and illegal, that desperate women whispered about when they found themselves in impossible situations. Doc Merritt's expression hardened. "No," he said flatly. "I won't do that, Clara. Not for you, not for anyone. That's not medicine. That's murder, and I won't have it on my conscience." "Then what am I supposed to do?" Her voice broke, all the fear and grief she'd been holding back spilling over. "He's gone, Doc. Talon's gone, and the whole town thinks I'm some kind of fool who got herself abandoned, and now I'm carrying his child, and I don't know how to— I can't—" "Breathe," Doc Merritt said firmly. "First thing, you breathe. Second thing, you remember that you're stronger than you think. Your father raised you to survive anything this world could throw at you, and that includes this." "I don't feel strong. I feel terrified." "Terrified is normal. Terrified means you understand what you're facing. But you're not alone in this, Clara. I'll help you through it. I'll make sure you and the baby stay healthy, and I'll do it for free because that's what your father would have wanted." Tears burned hot down Clara's cheeks. "The town's going to crucify me when they find out." "Let them talk. They've been talking since you married Greyhawk anyway. You just keep your head up and remember that their opinions don't mean a damn thing in the face of what you're building here." He leaned forward, his voice dropping low. "A baby is a miracle, Clara. Even when it comes at the worst possible time, even when it's wrapped up in heartbreak and loss, it's still a miracle. Don't let anyone make you feel ashamed of that." Clara wanted to believe him. She wanted to feel the wonder he was describing instead of the crushing weight of impossible choices and uncertain futures. But sitting there in Doc Merritt's warm kitchen while snow piled up outside, all she could feel was the vast, terrifying space where Talon should have been. She walked home through the storm, her hand pressed protectively against her stomach, and tried to imagine a future where she could do this alone. The next weeks were brutal. The morning sickness gave way to bone-deep exhaustion that made teaching feel like climbing a mountain every day. Clara pushed through it because she had no choice, standing in front of her classroom of 8 children and explaining arithmetic while her vision swam and her back ached. The mothers who brought their children started whispering more loudly, their eyes following the slight changes in Clara's body that she tried desperately to hide beneath loose dresses and shawls. She knew the exact moment the truth became common knowledge. It was a Tuesday morning in late November, and Mrs. Crenshaw arrived to collect her daughter with a look of vindicated disgust on her face. "I heard some disturbing news, Mrs. Greyhawk," she said, her voice dripping false concern. "Or should I say Miss Whitmore, since your husband abandoned you weeks ago. Is it true you're expecting?" Clara kept her expression neutral, refusing to give the woman the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. "My personal affairs are none of your concern, Mrs. Crenshaw. They become my concern when you're teaching my daughter. I won't have a woman of loose morals influencing impressionable children." "Loose morals?" Clara's voice went dangerously soft. "I'm married, Mrs. Crenshaw. Or had you forgotten? Married to a savage who ran off with another woman the moment he got tired of you. And now you're carrying his bastard— Get out!" Clara's control finally snapped. "Get out of my schoolhouse right now, or I swear I'll throw you out myself." Mrs. Crenshaw's face turned purple with rage. "You'll regret this. I'll see to it that you never teach in this town again. In fact, I'll make sure you're run out completely. A woman like you has no place in decent society." She swept out, dragging her wide-eyed daughter behind her. Clara stood frozen in the empty classroom, her hands shaking, knowing that she'd just made an enemy who wouldn't rest until she'd destroyed everything Clara had left. The campaign started immediately. By that evening, 3 more families had withdrawn their children from Clara's school. By the end of the week, she had only 2 students left, the Miller twins, whose father was too drunk most days to care where his kids spent their time. Clara taught them anyway, pouring everything she had into those 2 small faces, refusing to let Mrs. Crenshaw's poison steal this last piece of her father's legacy. But the isolation was suffocating. When Clara walked to the mercantile, conversation stopped. Women crossed the street to avoid her. The banker who'd been forced to leave her land alone now looked at her with barely concealed contempt, as if he was counting the days until she failed and he could finally seize what he'd always wanted. Only Doc Merritt treated her the same, and his kindness became the thin thread keeping Clara tethered to hope. One frozen December morning, Clara was chopping wood behind the house when the axe slipped and came down hard on the chopping block, missing her foot by inches. She stood there shaking, staring at where the blade had buried itself in the wood, and felt something inside her break open. She couldn't do this. She couldn't survive a frontier winter alone and pregnant with no help, no support, no one to carry the weight when her body finally gave out under the strain. She needed Talon, even if he didn't love her, even if he'd never wanted this child. She needed him because the alternative was dying alone in the snow, and her stubborn pride wasn't worth her baby's life. But she had no idea where he'd gone. That afternoon, Clara bundled herself against the cold and walked to the livery, where old Samuel Griggs spent most days tending horses and avoiding his sharp-tongued wife. He looked up when Clara entered, surprise flickering across his weathered face. "Mrs. Greyhawk, what can I do for you?" "I need to find my husband," Clara said, too desperate for subtlety. "You helped him stable his horse. Did he say where he was going when he left?" Samuel's expression shuddered. "I don't get involved in marital disputes, ma'am." "I'm not asking you to get involved. I'm asking you to help me survive." Clara pulled back her shawl, letting him see the curve of her belly that she could no longer fully hide. "I'm carrying his child, Mr. Griggs. I need to find him before winter gets worse, and I'm running out of time." The old man stared at her stomach, something like pity crossing his face. Then he sighed and pulled a piece of paper from his pocket, scratched out an address in pencil, and handed it over. "He didn't tell me where he was going," Samuel said quietly, "but Celine Vance mentioned heading north to Montana Territory before she left. Said something about mining camps near Helena. That's all I know." Clara took the paper with trembling hands. Montana. 300 miles through winter mountains with no guarantee Talon was even there, no guarantee he'd care if she found him. But it was the only lead she had, and desperation made bad odds look almost reasonable. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me yet. That's a hard road for a woman in your condition. You sure you want to risk it?" Clara thought about the empty schoolhouse, the hostile town, the winter closing in with nothing but her own stubbornness to keep her warm. She thought about her baby, who deserved a father even if that father had run away from the very idea of becoming one. "I don't have a choice," she said. She used the last of her savings to book passage on a freight wagon heading north the following week. The driver, a gruff man named Hank who'd lost 3 fingers to frostbite and didn't waste time on pleasantries, looked at her like she was insane. "You know what you're asking?" he said. "That's mountain country. Weather turns on you fast, and there's no guarantee we make it through before the passes close. A woman in your state has no business making that journey." "A woman in my state has no business doing a lot of things," Clara replied. "But here we are. I can pay half now and half when we reach Helena. That's all I've got." Hank studied her for a long moment, then spat into the dirt. "Your funeral. We leave at dawn. Don't be late." Clara spent her last night in Red Mesa packing everything she could carry in a single trunk. Her warmest clothes, her father's books, the quilt her mother had made before she died. She walked through the empty schoolhouse one final time, trailing her fingers over the desks her father had built, feeling the weight of every dream she was leaving behind. Then she locked the door and walked away without looking back. The journey north was everything Hank promised, and worse. The wagon rattled over frozen roads that threatened to shake Clara's teeth loose, and the cold was relentless, seeping through her layers until she couldn't remember what warmth felt like. They traveled with 2 other passengers, a young couple heading to find the woman's brother and an old prospector chasing rumors of silver strikes, but Clara kept to herself, nursing her secret and her grief in equal measure. The morning sickness returned with a vengeance, forcing Hank to stop the wagon more than once, while Clara emptied her stomach into the snow. The young woman offered sympathetic looks but kept her distance, and Clara understood. She looked like what she was, a woman running from scandal, carrying shame like baggage she couldn't set down. On the 4th day, they crossed into Montana Territory, and Clara got her first glimpse of the country Talon might have chosen over her. It was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way, Mountains that scraped the sky, forests so dense they swallowed light, rivers frozen solid beneath bridges that looked like they'd collapse under a strong wind. She understood why someone might come here to disappear. She just hoped Talon hadn't disappeared completely. They reached Helena on a bitter morning in mid-December. The town sprawled across hillsides scarred by mining operations and desperate ambition. Hank dropped her at a boarding house that charged too much for a room barely big enough to turn around in, and Clara paid with the last of her money, knowing she'd have to find work soon or end up on the street. But first, she had to find Talon. Helena was chaos. Mud and noise and men from every corner of the world chasing the promise of gold and silver and something better than wherever they'd come from. Clara walked the crowded streets with her shawl pulled tight, asking anyone who'd listen if they'd seen a man matching Talon's description. Most ignored her. Some leered. A few offered information that led nowhere. She was ready to give up when she spotted Celine Vance coming out of a saloon on Wallace Street. Clara's heart slammed against her ribs. She crossed the street before she could think better of it, her voice sharp and accusing. "Where is he?" Celine turned, surprise flickering across her face before settling into something harder. "Clara Whitmore. Or should I say Greyhawk? I heard you two had dissolved that little arrangement. Where's Talon? How should I know? Because you left Red Mesa together, because everyone said you two—" Clara couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't give voice to the thing that had haunted her every night since Talon disappeared. Celine's laugh was bitter. "Everyone said we ran off together? Is that what you think happened?" "Didn't it?" "No, Clara, it didn't." Celine stepped closer, and for the first time Clara saw something like regret in her eyes. "I left Red Mesa alone. Talon was gone before I even packed my things. I came north because I had business here, not because I was following him. Whatever you two destroyed, you managed it without my help." Clara felt the ground shift beneath her feet. "You're lying." "Why would I lie? You already hate me. What difference does the truth make now?" Celine studied Clara's face, her gaze dropping to the belly Clara could no longer hide. Her expression shifted, something like understanding settling into place. "You're pregnant." It wasn't a question. Clara didn't bother denying it. "Does he know?" Celine asked. "No, he left before I knew myself." Celine was quiet for a moment. Then, "He's not here, Clara. I haven't seen him since Red Mesa. If he came to Montana, he didn't come to Helena." Despair crashed over Clara like a wave. She'd gambled everything on a rumor and a desperate hope. And now she was 300 miles from home with no money, no answers, and winter closing in. "Why did you come back?" Clara asked, her voice breaking. "Why did you show up in Red Mesa and ruin everything?" "Because I was a fool," Celine said quietly. "Because I thought Talon and I had unfinished business, and I wanted to see if there was anything left worth salvaging. But the moment I saw the way he looked at you, the way he protected you, even when you didn't know it, I knew I'd already lost. He never looked at me like that, Clara, not even when we were together in Nevada." "Then why did he leave?" "You'd have to ask him that. But if I had to guess?" Celine's voice went soft. "He left because he was scared. Talon doesn't believe good things last. Every person he's ever cared about has either left him or died, so he learned to leave first. It's the only way he knows how to survive." The words settled into Clara's chest, heavy and true. She thought about Talon's mother dying when he was 12, about his father abandoning them both, about a lifetime of learning that love was just another kind of loss waiting to happen. "I need to find him," Clara whispered. "Then you better start looking beyond Helena," Celine said. "Try the mining camps east of here, places like Confederate Gulch or Diamond City. If Talon wanted to disappear, that's where he'd go. Those camps are lawless enough that no one asks questions." Clara looked at the woman who'd once seemed like her enemy and saw something unexpected. An ally, maybe, or at least someone who understood what it meant to love a man who didn't know how to be loved in return. "Thank you," Clara said. Celine nodded, started to walk away, then paused. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry. I didn't come to Red Mesa to destroy your marriage. I just wanted answers to old questions, and by the time I realized what I was wrecking, it was already too late." She disappeared into the crowd, leaving Clara standing alone on a muddy street in a town that wasn't home, carrying a child whose father might be impossible to find. But Clara had come too far to give up now. She spent the next week working in the boarding house to pay for her room, scrubbing floors, washing linens, cooking meals for travelers who barely acknowledged her existence. At night, she lay in her narrow bed and felt the baby move for the first time, a flutter so faint she almost missed it. The sensation brought tears to her eyes, wonder and terror tangled together, the reality of the life growing inside her becoming impossible to ignore. She was going to be a mother. Whether Talon came back or not, whether she found him or not, she was going to bring a child into this hard world and do her best to give them something better than what either parent had known. The thought terrified her. It also gave her strength. On Christmas Eve, Clara boarded a smaller wagon heading to the mining camps, squeezed between supplies and miners who smelled like sweat and desperation. The driver told her they'd reach Confederate Gulch by nightfall if the weather held, and Clara prayed to forces she wasn't sure were listening that she'd find what she was looking for before her money and her luck finally ran out. The camp materialized out of the frozen twilight like something from a fever dream. Tents and rough shacks clustered along a half-frozen creek, smoke rising from 100 cook fires, the sound of men shouting and laughing and fighting echoing through the thin mountain air. Clara climbed down from the wagon on shaking legs and looked around at the chaos, wondering where to even begin. "You lost, ma'am?" A young miner with kind eyes stopped beside her. "This ain't exactly the place for a lady." "I'm looking for someone," Clara said. "A man named Talon Greyhawk, half Apache, dark hair, quiet. Have you seen him?" The miner frowned. "Can't say I have, but I only been here a few weeks myself. You might try the supply tent. Everyone comes through there eventually. If he's in camp, someone there will know." Clara thanked him and made her way toward the largest tent, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst through her ribs. She'd come so far, risked so much, gambled her life and her baby's life, on the slim chance that Talon might be here, might be findable, might care enough to come back. But as she pushed through the tent flap and scanned the crowd of weathered faces, her hope began to crumble. None of them were Talon. None of them were even close. She was turning to leave when a voice stopped her cold. "Clara?" She spun around and found herself staring at Talon Greyhawk, thinner than she remembered, his face shadowed with beard growth and exhaustion, his eyes wide with shock that mirrored her own. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Talon crossed the tent in 3 long strides and stopped just short of touching her, his hands clenched at his sides like he didn't trust himself to reach for her. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice rough. Clara opened her mouth to answer, to tell him everything, about the baby, about the town turning against her, about the desperate journey north that had almost killed her. But before she could speak, another voice cut through the moment. "Talon? You coming or not?" A man appeared beside them, the same man Clara had seen Talon talking to back in Red Mesa, the one whose presence had sparked her jealous assumption that Talon had someone else. He looked from Talon to Clara and back again, confusion crossing his face. "Everything all right?" the man asked. Talon didn't answer. He was staring at Clara like she was a ghost he couldn't quite believe in. And Clara was staring back, her heart breaking all over again because even now, even after she'd crossed half a territory to find him, she could see the distance in his eyes. He'd left Red Mesa to get away from her, and she'd followed him anyway. The realization crashed over her like ice water. She'd made another terrible mistake. "I shouldn't have come," she whispered. "I'm sorry, I'll go." She turned to leave, her vision blurring with tears, but Talon's hand shot out and caught her wrist, gentle but firm, stopping her. "Don't," he said. "Don't run. Not yet." Clara looked down at his hand on her wrist, then up at his face, and saw something there she couldn't quite name. Fear, maybe. Or hope. Or the same desperate confusion she felt churning in her own chest. "We need to talk," Talon said quietly. "Somewhere private." The other man cleared his throat. "I'll just go. Catch up with you later, Tal." He disappeared into the crowd, leaving them alone in the chaos of the supply tent. Talon released Clara's wrist but didn't step back, and she could feel the heat of him even through the cold that permeated everything. "Why did you come here?" he asked again. This time Clara found her voice. "Because I needed to find you. Because we made a mistake, Talon. Both of us. We destroyed something that could have been real because we were too scared to admit what it was becoming." "Clara, let me finish." She took a shaky breath. "I saw you with that man back in Red Mesa, and I let myself think that you wanted someone else. That our marriage was just a burden you couldn't wait to escape. So I ended it before you could, before I had to watch you leave me the way everyone else has left. But I was wrong. Wasn't I? Tell me I was wrong. Talon's jaw tightened. That man is my half-brother, my father's son from his second marriage. He tracked me down to tell me our father died and left me a piece of worthless land I don't want. We were talking about whether I should contest the will or let it go. That's all it was, Clara. A conversation about a dead man I never forgave and property I don't need. The words hit Clara like a physical blow. Your brother. My brother, Talon confirmed. Not a lover, not a rival, just family I didn't know I had until he showed up looking for closure I couldn't give him. And Celine? Something dark crossed Talon's expression. Celine was a mistake from a long time ago. We were together in Nevada for a few months before I came to Red Mesa, and it ended badly. When she showed up, I knew she wanted to finish conversations we'd left unfinished, but I also knew I couldn't give her what she wanted. Not anymore. Not when I'd already... He stopped, his hands clenching again. Not when my heart was somewhere else. Clara felt her breath catch. Where? With you. The words came out rough, like they hurt to say. With my wife, who I'd somehow managed to fall in love with, even though I'd promised myself I wouldn't, who I'd watched become the strongest person I'd ever known, while I was too much of a coward to tell her what she meant to me. Tears spilled hot down Clara's cheeks. Then why did you leave? Because you wanted to end the marriage, and I thought I was doing you a favor, giving you the freedom to find someone better, someone the town wouldn't hate you for choosing. I signed those papers and left because I thought that's what you wanted, that you'd seen through the arrangement to the truth underneath, that I'm not good enough for you, Clara. I never was. You're wrong, Clara whispered. You're so wrong it breaks my heart. Before Talon could respond, Clara pulled back her shawl and let him see what she'd traveled 300 miles to tell him. His eyes dropped to her swollen belly, and she watched the color drain from his face. I'm pregnant, she said quietly, with your child. And I need you to tell me right now, are you going to run again, or are you going to stay? Talon stared at Clara's belly like it was something his mind couldn't quite process, a truth too enormous to fit inside the careful walls he'd built around his heart. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. No sound came out. Clara watched the emotions chase across his face. Shock, bleeding into disbelief. Disbelief into something that looked almost like fear. And finally, slowly, into a wonder so raw it made her chest ache. You're... His voice broke. He cleared his throat and tried again. How long have you known? 2 months? Maybe a little more? Clara kept her hand pressed against the swell of her stomach, anchoring herself to the reality of it. I didn't know when you left. I found out after you'd already gone, and I thought I could manage alone, but... Alone? The word came out sharp, almost angry. Talon took a step closer, his hands lifting like he wanted to touch her, but didn't know if he had the right. You've been dealing with this alone? For 2 months? What choice did I have? You were gone, Talon. You signed the divorce papers and disappeared, and I didn't know where to find you until Celine mentioned Montana. Clara's voice cracked despite her best efforts to keep it steady. The town turned on me the moment they figured it out. Mrs. Crenshaw made sure everyone knew I was carrying a child out of wedlock. Never mind that we're still legally married until a judge says otherwise. I lost the school, lost almost everything. Doc Merritt was the only one who'd even speak to me. Talon's face had gone hard, his jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. Mrs. Crenshaw, that poisonous... He stopped himself, breathing hard through his nose. She always did enjoy other people's suffering. I'm sorry, Clara. I'm so damn sorry you had to face that alone. I didn't come here for apologies. Clara lifted her chin, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill over. I came here because this child deserves a father, and because I needed to know... She faltered, the question too big and too terrifying to speak aloud. Know what? Talon asked softly. If you ever wanted this... Wanted me. Or if I was just a convenient arrangement that got complicated. The words tumbled out before she could stop them. I need to know if you're going to run again, Talon, because I can't survive you leaving twice. The noise of the supply tent faded to a dull roar around them. Talon moved then, closing the distance between them in a single step, his hands coming up to cup her face with a gentleness that contradicted the roughness of his calloused palms. Clara's breath caught as he tilted her face up, forcing her to meet his eyes. "I'm not running," he said, and his voice was rough with emotion. "Not from this, not from you, not ever again. I was a coward once, Clara. I let fear make my decisions, and I lost the best thing that ever happened to me because I was too proud and too scared to fight for it. But I'm done being that man." "You mean it?" Clara searched his face, desperate to believe him, but terrified of being wrong. "I mean it." He brushed his thumb across her cheekbone, wiping away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "I should have fought for you in Red Mesa. Should have told you the truth about my brother, about Celine, about how much you'd come to mean to me. Instead, I signed those papers like a fool and ran because I thought that's what you wanted. But I'm here now, and I'm telling you, I love you, Clara. I think I started falling the first time you mended my shirt without being asked, and I never stopped. This baby—" His gaze dropped to her stomach, and something in his expression cracked open. "This baby is a gift I don't deserve, but I swear to you, I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of it, of both of you." Clara's composure shattered. She threw her arms around his neck and held on like he was the only solid thing in a world that wouldn't stop spinning. Talon caught her, his arms coming around her waist, careful of her belly, and for the first time in months, Clara felt safe. Truly, completely safe. "I love you too," she whispered against his shoulder. "I was so scared I'd never get to tell you that." They stood like that for a long moment, holding each other in the middle of a crowded tent full of strangers, neither of them caring who saw or what anyone thought. When they finally pulled apart, Talon kept one arm around Clara's waist, like he couldn't bear to let her go completely. "You're exhausted," he said, studying her face with concern. "When did you last eat? Sleep somewhere warm?" "The boarding house in Helena? But I spent most of my money getting there, and what was left went to the wagon ride here." Clara tried to smile, but it came out trembling. "I wasn't exactly thinking about the return trip." Talon's expression darkened. "You traveled 300 miles in your condition with barely any money and no plan for getting back?" "I had a plan. The plan was finding you." "Clara, don't." She pressed her fingers against his lips, silencing him. "I know it was reckless. I know I could have lost the baby, lost myself, lost everything. But I had to try, Talon. I had to know if there was any chance of saving this. Saving us." He caught her hand, pressed a kiss to her palm. "You could have died out there." "I didn't. I'm here, and so are you, and that's all that matters now." Talon looked like he wanted to argue, wanted to lecture her about all the ways her journey could have ended in tragedy, but instead he just pulled her close again and pressed his forehead against hers. "We're going back to Red Mesa," he said quietly. "Tonight, if possible. You need somewhere warm and safe, and I need to make this right with you, properly." "How?" "However you'll let me." He pulled back enough to meet her eyes. "I want to marry you again, Clara. Not as an arrangement, not as protection against the bank or the town's prejudice. I want to marry you because I love you, because you're carrying my child, and because I can't imagine a future that doesn't have you in it." Clara felt fresh tears slip down her cheeks, but this time they weren't born of grief or fear. "I'd like that," she whispered. "I'd like that very much." They left Confederate Gulch the next morning, Talon having traded 3 months' worth of mining wages for passage on a freight wagon heading south. The driver, a grizzled man who asked no questions and expected none in return, made room for them among crates of supplies and tools, and Clara settled into the wagon bed with Talon's coat wrapped around her shoulders and his arms steady at her back. The journey back was nothing like the desperate flight north had been. Talon made sure she ate at every stop, found her the warmest places to sleep, carried her across icy streams when the wagon couldn't ford them safely. At night, when they camped under stars so bright they looked close enough to touch, he'd hold her and talk about the future they'd build together. A home with a garden for her, and a stable for him, children learning both Apache and English, a life where neither of them would have to hide who they were or who they loved. "What will we do about the town?" Clara asked one night, her head resting on his shoulder. "Mrs. Crenshaw and her campaign against me, the people who think our marriage is shameful?" "We ignore them," Talon said simply. We build our life and let them talk themselves hoarse. Eventually they'll find someone else to judge. And if they don't, he shrugged. We'll survive anyway. We're good at that. Clara smiled in the darkness. We are, aren't we? The best. They reached Helena on New Year's Eve and found the town celebrating with drunken abandon. Talon kept Clara close as they navigated the crowded streets, his hand protective on her lower back, his eyes scanning for threats the way he always did. They were nearly to the boarding house when a familiar voice called out, "Talon Greyhawk, I'll be damned!" They turned to find Celine Vance standing in the doorway of a saloon, a glass of whiskey in one hand and a sad smile on her face. She looked from Talon to Clara, taking in the way he held her, the obvious swell of Clara's pregnancy, the quiet claim they'd made on each other. "You found him," Celine said to Clara. "I did." "And he's staying?" "I am," Talon said, his voice leaving no room for doubt. Celine nodded slowly. "Good. That's good." She took a drink, her smile turning wry. "I told you he never looked at me the way he looked at you. Guess I was right." "Celine," Talon started, but she waved him off. "Don't. We don't need to do this again." She straightened her shoulders, some of her old fire returning. "I came to Montana to run from my mistakes, Talon. Turns out you can't outrun the past, but you can stop letting it define your future. You two figured that out faster than I did." "I'm sorry," Clara said quietly, "for how everything happened in Red Mesa. For the part I played in. You don't owe me an apology. You fought for what you wanted, and you won. That's more than most people manage." Celine raised her glass in a mock toast. "Be happy, Clara Greyhawk. Make him happy. And when that baby comes, teach them that love doesn't have to hurt the way we all thought it did." She turned and disappeared back into the saloon, leaving them standing in the snowy street with the sound of celebration echoing around them. Clara felt Talon's arm tighten around her waist. "You all right?" he asked. "I think so. Are you?" "Yeah." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "I think I finally am." They stayed in Helena long enough for Clara to rest and regain some strength, then continued south as soon as the weather cleared. The closer they got to Red Mesa, the more Clara's anxiety grew. She didn't know what kind of reception they'd face, didn't know if the town would accept Talon's return or if Mrs. Crenshaw's poison had spread too deep to be countered. But when they finally rolled into Red Mesa on a gray January afternoon, none of that mattered. Talon helped her down from the wagon, and together they walked up the path to the house that had been Clara's father's, and then hers, and then theirs. And Clara felt something settle in her chest. She was home. The house was cold and empty, a thin layer of dust coating everything, but it was structurally sound. Talon built a fire while Clara unpacked their few belongings, and within an hour, the kitchen was warm and the coffee was hot, and they were sitting across from each other at the table just like they had months ago before everything fell apart. "What now?" Clara asked. Talon reached across the table and took her hand. "Now we start over. We do this right." The next morning, they went to see Doc Merritt. The old physician opened his door, took one look at them standing together on his porch, and broke into a grin that made him look 20 years younger. "Well, well, the prodigal husband returns." He ushered them inside, his gaze sharp as it swept over Clara. "You're looking better than the last time I saw you, girl. Montana must have agreed with you." "Montana gave me back what I'd lost," Clara said, squeezing Talon's hand. Doc Merritt examined her thoroughly, checking the baby's position and heartbeat, asking questions about her symptoms and her journey north. When he was satisfied, he sat back and regarded them both with something like pride. "The baby's healthy, strong heartbeat, good size for the dates. You're due sometime in early April, I'd wager. That gives us a few months to prepare." He looked at Talon. "You planning to stick around this time?" "I'm not going anywhere," Talon said firmly. "Good. She'll need you, especially toward the end. Birth is hard work, and it's harder when you're facing it alone." Doc Merritt pulled out a worn notebook and started writing. "I'll want to see her every 2 weeks until March, then weekly after that. Any bleeding, any pain, any concern at all, you come find me immediately. Understood?" They both nodded. "And one more thing," Doc Merritt fixed Talon with a stern look. "This town's going to have opinions about you being back. Some of them won't be kind. You need to decide right now if you can handle that without making things worse for Clara. I can handle it, Talon said. Can you? Because I've seen what happens when men like you, men who faced more prejudice than anyone should have to endure, finally reach their breaking point. And I don't want Clara caught in the crossfire when someone says the wrong thing and you decide you've had enough. Talon was quiet for a long moment. Then, I won't fight them with my fists. I'll fight them by being the best husband and father I know how to be. By building a life here that's so solid they can't tear it down no matter how hard they try. That's the only fight that matters now. Doc Merritt studied him, then nodded. All right then. Get out of here, both of you. Come back in 2 weeks. They walked home through streets that felt both familiar and foreign, and Clara braced herself for the stares and whispers that would inevitably come. But the town seemed quieter than she remembered, and the few people they passed either nodded politely or looked away quickly, as if they were embarrassed by how they'd treated her. It wasn't until they reached the mercantile that Clara understood why. Mrs. Crenshaw was standing outside, talking to another woman in low, vicious tones. When she saw Clara and Talon approaching, her face twisted with vindictive pleasure. Well, look who's back, she announced loudly enough for half the street to hear. The savage who abandoned his wife, come crawling home now that she's carrying his bastard. How noble of you, Mr. Greyhawk. Talon went still beside Clara, every muscle in his body tensing. Clara felt her own anger spike, sharp and protective. But before either of them could respond, another voice cut through the tension. That's enough, Judith. They all turned to find Samuel Griggs standing in the doorway of his livery, his weathered face set in hard lines. You've spent months spreading poison about this woman, and I've kept my mouth shut because I don't involve myself in other people's business. But I'm done being quiet. Mrs. Crenshaw's eyes narrowed. I don't know what you think you're... Talon Greyhawk didn't abandon anyone, Samuel said flatly. His wife ended their marriage and he respected her wishes by leaving. If that makes him a savage in your eyes, then I'd say your definition needs work. And that child she's carrying, they're still legally married, which makes it legitimate whether you like it or not. You don't know what you're talking about, Mrs. Crenshaw sputtered. Don't I? I know Clara Whitmore came to this town as a little girl with a father who taught anyone who wanted to learn, regardless of their background or their ability to pay. I know she kept that school running after he died, even when you and your friends tried to shut her down because you couldn't stand the idea of a woman teaching your children. And I know she married Talon Greyhawk to save her land, and somewhere along the way they fell in love. And the only shameful thing about this whole situation is how this town treated her for it. Silence fell across the street. Clara felt tears prick her eyes, not from shame this time, but from gratitude. Samuel Griggs had never been friendly with her, had barely spoken more than necessary when she came to the livery, but he was defending her now when it mattered most. Mrs. Crenshaw's face had gone purple with rage. How dare you? I dare because someone needs to. Samuel looked around at the small crowd that had gathered. We call ourselves a civilized community, but we drove a pregnant woman out into the winter because we were more interested in gossip than decency. That's not civilization. That's cowardice. And I, for one, am ashamed I didn't speak up sooner. He turned and walked back into his livery, leaving Mrs. Crenshaw sputtering in the street. The crowd began to disperse, some looking ashamed, others defiant, but the energy had shifted. Clara felt it like a physical change in the air, the first crack in the wall of judgment the town had built around her. Talon's hand found hers, squeezing gently. Let's go home, he said quietly. They walked back in silence, both processing what had just happened. When they reached the house, Clara sank into a chair and pressed her hands against her face, overwhelmed by the flood of emotion she could no longer contain. Hey, Talon knelt beside her, his hands gentle on her knees. Talk to me. I didn't expect anyone to defend us. I thought we'd be fighting this battle alone. We're not alone. Talon brushed a strand of hair back from her face. Samuel spoke up today, and maybe tomorrow someone else will. And even if they don't, even if it's just us against the whole town, we'll be fine. Because we have each other, and that's more than enough. Clara leaned into his touch, drawing strength from his certainty. When did you become so optimistic? When I realized I had something worth being optimistic about. He pressed a kiss to her forehead. You, this baby, the future we're building. That's worth fighting for, Clara. worth enduring whatever the town throws at us. The days that followed fell into a new rhythm. Talon threw himself into repairing the property with renewed purpose, fixing everything that had fallen into disrepair during the months of Clara's struggle and his absence. He rebuilt the fence line, cleared the irrigation ditches, patched the roof properly this time, and started planning a larger barn for the horses he wanted to raise. Clara watched him work with a sense of wonder, seeing not just the physical labor but the commitment behind it, the promise he was building board by board, nail by nail. She reopened the school hesitantly, half expecting no students to show, but the Miller twins returned immediately, followed by 2 more children whose parents seemed willing to overlook scandal for the sake of education. It wasn't many, but it was a start. In the evenings, they'd sit together and talk about names for the baby. Talon wanted something that honored both their heritages, a name that could belong to a child of 2 worlds. Claire suggested they wait until after the birth, until they could see the baby's face and know what fit. "What if it's a girl?" she asked one night, her hand resting on her belly where the baby was moving restlessly. "Then we'll raise her to be strong like her mother," Talon said. "Teach her that she doesn't have to choose between who she is and who the world wants her to be. She can be both." "And if it's a boy?" "Same thing, strong, compassionate, brave enough to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard." Talon covered her hand with his, feeling the baby kick against their joined palms. "Either way, they'll know they're loved. That's what matters most." Clara leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the baby settle as if it recognized its father's voice. "I used to be so scared of this," she admitted, "of raising a child alone, of not being enough. But with you here, I'm not scared anymore. You were always enough, Clara. You survived months without me because you're stronger than you know. I'm just grateful I get to be here for the rest of it." The weeks passed, winter beginning its slow retreat into spring. Clara's belly grew rounder, her movements slower, her back aching constantly from the weight she carried. Talon was endlessly patient, helping her with tasks that had become difficult, rubbing her feet when they swelled, holding her when the fear of childbirth crept in during the quiet hours before dawn. One February morning, Clara woke to find Talon already gone, and a note on the kitchen table. "Gone to town. Back soon. Rest." She was drinking tea and trying to settle her restless stomach when she heard horses outside. Multiple horses, which was unusual. Clara moved to the window and felt her breath catch. Talon was leading a wagon toward the house, and in the wagon bed was furniture, a beautiful wooden cradle, a rocking chair, a chest of drawers. Behind him rode Samuel Griggs and 2 other men from town, all carrying lumber and tools. Clara wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped onto the porch as Talon climbed down from the wagon. "What's all this?" she asked. "We're building a nursery," Talon said, a hint of pride in his voice. "Or rather, we're converting the spare room into one. I asked Samuel if he knew anyone who could help, and he volunteered. Brought reinforcements, too." Samuel tipped his hat to Clara. "Figured the baby needs a proper room. And these 2," he gestured to the other men, "felt the same way." Clara recognized them as fathers of children who'd recently returned to her school. She felt tears threaten again, overwhelmed by the gesture. "You don't have to do this," she said. "We know," one of the men replied. "But we want to. Call it an apology for how this town treated you." They worked all day, the sound of hammering and sawing filling the house with purposeful noise. Clara made coffee and brought out food, watching as these men, some of whom had crossed the street to avoid her just months ago, built a space for her child with their own hands. By evening, the room was transformed. The cradle sat in one corner, the rocking chair by the window, the chest ready to hold tiny clothes and blankets. Talon had even started painting one wall a soft blue-gray, the color of dawn breaking over the mountains. When the others left, Clara stood in the doorway of the nursery and felt the last of her fear dissolve. This was real. This life she and Talon were building was actually real, and people were starting to see it for what it was, not a scandal or an arrangement, but a family being born from the ashes of everything they'd both lost. "What do you think?" Talon asked, coming to stand behind her, his arms wrapping around her from behind, his hands resting on her belly. "I think it's perfect," Clara whispered. "I think everything is finally exactly how it's supposed to be." The baby kicked hard against Talon's palm, and they both laughed. The sound filling the house with something it had been missing for too long: joy, uncomplicated and pure. But the universe, Clara was learning, had a way of testing hope right when it felt most secure. 3 days later, the first labor pains began, and they came 6 weeks too early. Clara was kneading bread dough when the first contraction seized her, sharp and sudden enough to make her gasp and grip the edge of the table. She stood frozen, flour dusting her hands, waiting to see if it would come again. The baby wasn't due for another 6 weeks. This couldn't be labor. It was too soon, too sudden, too... Another contraction rolled through her, harder this time, stealing her breath and sending pain radiating from her lower back through her entire body. The bread dough slipped from her fingers and hit the floor with a wet slap. "Talon!" Her voice came out thin and scared, barely louder than a whisper. He was in the barn, too far to hear. Clara tried to move toward the door, but a third contraction doubled her over, and she had to grab the chair to keep from falling. Fear clawed up her throat, cold and suffocating. Something was wrong. Babies born this early often didn't survive, and even if they did, "Talon!" She screamed it this time, putting every ounce of strength she had left into the sound. She heard his boots hit the porch at a run, heard the door slam open. Then he was there, his hands on her shoulders, his face going pale as he took in her bent posture and the pain written across her features. "What's wrong? What happened?" "The baby," Clara gasped. "It's coming. Now. Too early." Talon's expression shifted from concern to something closer to terror, but his hands remained steady as he guided her to the chair. "How long between contractions?" "I don't know. Minutes? Not long enough." Another wave of pain hit, and Clara gripped his arm hard enough to leave marks. "We need Doc Merritt. Please, Talon, something's wrong." He was already moving, settling her as comfortably as he could before grabbing his coat. "I'll be back in 10 minutes. Don't try to stand up. Don't try to do anything. Just breathe." "Don't leave me," Clara whispered, and hated how small her voice sounded. Talon dropped to his knees in front of her, his hands cupping her face. "I'm coming right back. I swear to you, Clara, I'm not leaving you alone in this." He kissed her forehead, and then he was gone, the sound of his horse's hooves echoing through the yard as he raced toward town. Clara sat in the chair and tried to breathe through the contractions that were coming faster now, closer together, each one more intense than the last. She pressed her hand against her belly and felt the baby moving, restless and agitated, and prayed to whatever forces might be listening that they would both survive this. The minutes stretched like hours. Clara lost track of how many contractions she endured, each one pulling a whimper from her throat despite her efforts to stay quiet. She was just starting to panic, convinced that Talon wouldn't make it back in time, that she'd have to face this alone after all. When she heard voices outside, Doc Merritt burst through the door with his medical bag, Talon right behind him. The old physician took one look at Clara and started barking orders. "Talon, get water boiling, clean linens, as many as we have. Clara, we need to get you to the bedroom. Can you walk?" "I think so." But when she tried to stand, another contraction hit so hard her knees buckled. Talon caught her before she could fall, sweeping her into his arms like she weighed nothing. "I've got you," he murmured against her hair. "I've got you." He carried her to their bedroom and laid her gently on the bed. Doc Merritt was already washing his hands, his movements efficient and practiced despite the urgency crackling through the air. "How far apart are the pains?" he asked. 2 minutes, Claire gasped. "Maybe less." Doc Merritt's mouth tightened. "That's fast for a first baby, especially one coming early. I need to examine you, see how far along you are." The examination was quick and professional, but Clara saw the concern deepen in Doc Merritt's eyes when he finished. "What is it?" Talon demanded. "What's wrong?" "The baby's in a hurry," Doc Merritt said carefully. "She's already quite dilated, which means this is happening whether we're ready or not. The concerning part is the baby's early. Lungs might not be fully developed, which means breathing could be difficult once it's born. We'll deal with that when we get there. Right now, we focus on getting through the delivery safely." "And if the baby can't breathe?" Clara asked, her voice breaking. "Then we help it breathe. I've delivered early babies before, Clara. Some of them make it, some of them don't. But I promise you, I'll do everything in my power to make sure yours does." It wasn't the reassurance Clara wanted, but it was honest, and right now honesty felt more valuable than false comfort. She nodded, gripping Talon's hand as another contraction built and crested and crashed through her. "What do you need me to do?" Talon asked Doc Merritt, his voice steady despite the fear Clara could see in his eyes. "Stay with her. Keep her calm. When it's time to push, help her sit up, and don't—" Doc Merritt met his gaze directly. "Don't let her see you panic. She needs your strength right now, not your fear." "I won't let her down," Talon said, and Clara heard the promise in it. The same promise he'd made when he came back to her, when he chose to stay, when he decided to stop running from the things that scared him most. The hours that followed blurred into a haze of pain and exhaustion. Clara had thought she understood suffering, had endured her father's death, her mother's absence, the brutal loneliness of those months after Talon left. But labor was a different kind of agony, relentless and all-consuming, leaving no room for anything except the primal work of bringing life into the world. Talon stayed beside her through all of it. He wiped her forehead with cool cloths, held her hand when the contractions peaked, murmured words of encouragement that Clara couldn't quite hear over the roaring in her ears, but that anchored her anyway. When she screamed, he didn't flinch. When she cursed him for getting her pregnant in the first place, he absorbed it without comment. And when she begged him to make it stop, to take away the pain, he pressed his forehead against hers and told her she was the strongest person he'd ever known. "I can't do this," Clara sobbed during a brief respite between contractions. "It's too much. I can't." "Yes, you can." Talon's voice was firm, leaving no room for doubt. "You've survived everything this world threw at you, Clara. You survived losing your parents, losing your home, losing me. You traveled 300 miles through winter mountains while pregnant because you refused to give up. You can survive this too, and I'll be right here with you every step of the way. Promise?" "I promise." Doc Merritt checked her progress again and nodded with satisfaction. "It's time. Next contraction, you need to push. Talon, help her sit up. Clara, when I tell you to push, you give it everything you've got. Understand?" Clara nodded, too exhausted to speak. Talon moved behind her, supporting her weight, his arms steady around her. The next contraction built like a wave gathering strength, and when it crested, Doc Merritt's voice cut through the haze. "Now, Clara, push!" She pushed, bearing down with every ounce of strength she had left, feeling something shift and tear inside her. The pain was transcendent, beyond anything she'd imagined, but she pushed through it because the alternative was failing her child, and that was something Clara refused to do. "Good," Doc Merritt said. "Again. One more. Come on, Clara." She pushed again, and this time she felt the baby move, felt the impossible pressure of a life trying to enter the world. Talon's arms tightened around her, his voice in her ear telling her she was amazing. She was doing it. Just a little more. "The head's crowning," Doc Merritt announced. "One more push should do it. On the next contraction, Clara, everything you've got." The contraction hit like a tidal wave, and Clara pushed with the last reserves of her strength, pushed until she thought she might break apart from the effort. And then suddenly, blessedly, there was relief. The baby sliding free in a rush of fluid and blood, Doc Merritt's hands catching it. Clara collapsed back against Talon, gasping for air, waiting for the sound she needed more than her next breath. The sound didn't come. Doc Merritt was moving quickly, his hands working over the baby's tiny body, his expression focused and grim. Clara tried to see, tried to sit up, but Talon held her gently in place. "Give him a moment," Talon whispered, but she could hear the fear in his voice. "Why isn't it crying?" Clara's voice cracked. "Doc, why isn't my baby crying?" "Because its lungs need help opening." Doc Merritt's hands moved with practiced efficiency, clearing the baby's mouth and nose, rubbing its back with a cloth. "Come on, little one. Breathe for me. Come on." Silence stretched like broken glass. Clara felt her heart breaking in real time, felt every terrible possibility crash over her at once. They'd come so far, fought so hard, survived so much, and for what? To lose their child in the first moments of its life? "Please," she whispered. "Please, please, please." And then, finally, a sound. Weak and thread-like at first, barely more than a mule, but it grew stronger, becoming the unmistakable wail of a newborn demanding entrance into the world. Doc Merritt's face split into a tired smile. "There we are. Welcome to the world, son." "Son." Clara's vision blurred with tears. It's a boy? It's a boy. Doc Merritt wrapped the baby in a clean blanket and carried him over, placing him gently in Clara's arms. Small, but breathing on his own now. That's a good sign. Clara looked down at her son and felt her entire world reorganize itself around this tiny, wrinkled creature with dark hair plastered to his head and eyes that seemed too knowing for something so new. He was perfect. Impossibly, miraculously perfect. "Talon," she whispered. "Look at him." Talon's arms were still around her, but now his attention was entirely on the baby. Clara watched emotions chase across his face. Wonder, terror, awe, love so fierce it transformed him. His hand reached out, trembling slightly, and touched the baby's cheek with a gentleness that made Clara's chest ache. "He's so small," Talon said, his voice rough. "He's perfect," Clara corrected. "He is." Talon pressed a kiss to Clara's temple, then another to the baby's forehead. "He really is." Doc Merritt worked efficiently to deliver the afterbirth and tend to Clara, but she barely noticed, too absorbed in studying every detail of her son's face. The baby had quieted in her arms, his dark eyes, Talon's eyes, blinking up at her with what seemed like curiosity. "He's early, which means he'll need extra care," Doc Merritt said as he cleaned up. "Keep him warm, feed him often, watch for any signs of breathing trouble. If his color turns blue or he struggles to eat, you send for me immediately. Understood?" "Understood," Talon said. Doc Merritt packed his bag and stood, exhaustion written across his weathered face. "You did well, Clara, better than well, and you—" He looked at Talon. "You did exactly what she needed. That boy's lucky to have both of you." "We're the lucky ones," Talon replied quietly. After Doc Merritt left, promising to return the next day to check on them, Clara and Talon were finally alone with their son. The sun was setting outside, painting the room in shades of amber and gold, and Clara felt the weight of the day settling over her like a blanket. Exhaustion, relief, and a bone-deep peace she hadn't known she was capable of feeling. "What should we name him?" she asked. Talon was quiet for a long moment, his hand resting on the baby's back, feeling the tiny rise and fall of each breath. "What about Daniel? It means strength and judgment. Seemed right, given how hard he fought to get here." Clara tested the name silently, watching her son's face. Daniel. Strong and simple. A name that could belong in both worlds he'd inherit. "Daniel Greyhawk. I like it." "Daniel," Talon repeated, and the baby's eyes seemed to focus on his father's voice. "Welcome home, son." The days that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and constant worry. Daniel was a fighter. He ate well, cried lustily when he needed something, and slowly began to gain weight. But Clara couldn't shake the fear that something would go wrong. Every time he slept too long, she'd wake Talon in a panic to make sure the baby was still breathing. Every time he fussed more than usual, she'd convince herself something terrible was happening. Talon bore her anxiety with endless patience. He'd wake at night to check on Daniel without complaint, rock him when he cried, change his tiny clothes with surprising competence for a new father. Clara would watch him holding their son and feel her heart expand in ways she hadn't known were possible. "You're a natural at this," she said one evening, watching Talon pace the nursery with Daniel against his shoulder. "I'm terrified every second," Talon admitted. "But I figure as long as I love him and try my best, the rest will sort itself out. That's all any parent can do." Talon looked at her, his expression serious. "I keep thinking about my own father, how he walked away and never looked back. And I swear to you, Clara, I will never be that man. Daniel will always know he's wanted. He'll always know he's loved." "I know." Clara held out her arms, and Talon brought the baby to her, settling them both comfortably in the rocking chair. "You're already a better father than yours ever was. Just by being here, you're giving Daniel something you never had." Daniel made a small sound, his tiny fist curling around Clara's finger with surprising strength. She looked down at him and felt the fierce protectiveness that came with motherhood, the knowledge that she would do anything, sacrifice anything, to keep this small life safe. Word of Daniel's birth spread through Red Mesa with the speed of all good gossip. To Clara's surprise, people began appearing at their door, not with judgment this time, but with gifts. Blankets and baby clothes, Jars of preserves and fresh bread, offers of help that seemed genuine rather than obligatory. Even Mrs. Crenshaw made an appearance, though her smile was forced and her words stiff. "I heard you had a boy," she said, standing awkwardly on the porch. "I brought some things my children outgrew." Clara accepted the bundle of clothes, searching the older woman's face for signs of mockery and finding only what looked like reluctant respect. "Thank you, Mrs. Crenshaw. That's very kind." "Well," Mrs. Crenshaw smoothed her skirt, clearly uncomfortable. "A baby is a blessing, regardless of the circumstances. I may not approve of everything that's happened, but I won't take that out on an innocent child." It wasn't an apology, but it was close enough. Clara watched her walk away and felt another piece of the wall between her and the town crumble. Samuel Griggs became an unexpected ally, stopping by regularly to help Talon with repairs and bringing news from town. He'd sit at their kitchen table with coffee and report which families were warming to the Greyhawks and which were still holding grudges, giving them a sense of where they stood in the community's ever-shifting judgment. "Miller's talking about sending his boys back to your school come fall," Samuel said one afternoon, "and I heard the Johnsons might do the same. Word's getting around that you're the best teacher this town's ever had, and people are starting to remember that." "I'm not sure I'm ready to reopen the school yet," Clara admitted, glancing toward the nursery where Daniel was sleeping. "Not with him so young. No rush. Just wanted you to know the door's opening again. Slowly, but it's opening." After Samuel left, Clara stood in the doorway of the nursery and watched Daniel sleep, his tiny chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm that had become her favorite sound in the world. Talon came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, and they stood together in comfortable silence. "Do you ever regret it?" Clara asked quietly. "Marrying me? All the trouble it brought?" "Never." Talon's answer was immediate and certain. "Every hard thing we went through led us here, to this moment, to him. How could I regret that?" "I love you," Clara said, leaning back into his warmth. "I don't say it enough, but I do. More than I knew I could love anyone." "I love you too." He pressed a kiss to her neck. "You and Daniel, you're my whole world. Everything else is just noise." When Daniel was 3 weeks old, Doc Merritt declared him healthy and strong enough that they could stop worrying quite so much. The relief Clara felt was almost physical, like a weight she'd been carrying finally lifted from her shoulders. That night, she and Talon sat together on the porch while Daniel slept inside, watching the stars emerge one by one against the darkening sky. "I've been thinking," Talon said, "about the future, about what we want to build here." "What do you want to build?" "A life that's big enough for all of us. A place where Daniel can grow up knowing both sides of his heritage, where he doesn't have to choose between being his mother's son or his father's, where the land we're standing on belongs to us completely, not because the law says so, but because we earned it with our own hands." Clara thought about her father's dream of a school where every child could learn regardless of their circumstances. She thought about Talon's mother, who'd loved a man from a different world and paid for it with her family's rejection. She thought about Daniel sleeping peacefully inside, unaware of the complicated legacy he'd inherited. "I want that too," she said, "but I also want more than just surviving. I want us to thrive. I want Daniel to see his parents build something meaningful, something that matters beyond just getting through each day." "Like what?" "I don't know yet, but I think we'll figure it out together." Clara reached for his hand, lacing their fingers together. "We're good at that. Figuring things out together." Talon smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. "We are, aren't we?" They sat in the growing darkness, hands joined, listening to the night sounds of the desert and the occasional whimper from inside where their son dreamed baby dreams. The road behind them had been hard, marked by loss and loneliness and mistakes that had nearly destroyed them both. But the road ahead felt full of possibility, and for the first time in her life, Clara wasn't afraid of what might come. She had Talon. She had Daniel. She had a home and a future and love that had survived everything the world could throw at it. That was enough. More than enough. It was everything. The storm that had been building on the horizon all day finally broke just after midnight. Clara woke to the sound of thunder rattling the windows and rain hammering the roof with enough force to make her worry about leaks. Beside her, Talon slept deeply, exhausted from a long day of fence repairs. And in the nursery, Daniel was crying. A thin, distressed sound that sent Clara's maternal instincts into overdrive. She slipped out of bed and padded to the nursery, lifting Daniel from his cradle and settling into the rocking chair to nurse him. He latched on hungrily, and Clara stroked his soft hair while watching lightning illuminate the room in stark flashes. The storm reminded her of that terrible journey to Montana, of the days she'd spent certain she would die alone in the snow before ever finding Talon again. It felt like a lifetime ago, like something that had happened to a different woman entirely. The Clara who'd made that desperate journey had been driven by fear and loneliness, and the fragile hope that love might be enough to save her. This Clara, the one sitting in a warm nursery with her son at her breast and her husband sleeping peacefully down the hall, knew that love was enough. Not because it made everything easy, but because it gave you a reason to fight when everything got hard. Thunder crashed again, closer this time, and Daniel pulled away from nursing to whimper at the noise. Clara held him against her shoulder and stood, swaying gently while humming a lullaby her mother had once sung to her. The words had been forgotten long ago, but the melody remained, passed down through generations of women who'd rocked their babies through storms both literal and metaphorical. "It's just noise," she murmured to Daniel. "Just the sky making a fuss. Nothing that can hurt you in here." But even as she said it, Clara heard something else beneath the thunder. A different sound, urgent and alarming. Hoofbeats approaching fast through the rain, then pounding on the front door. Talon was already moving, pulling on his pants as he headed for the door. Clara followed with Daniel still in her arms, her heart racing with sudden fear. Nothing good came from visitors in the middle of a storm. Talon opened the door to reveal a young man Clara vaguely recognized from town, soaking wet and breathing hard. "Mr. Greyhawk, you need to come quick. There's been an accident at the Miller place. Their barn got struck by lightning and caught fire, and half the roof collapsed. Samuel Griggs is hurt bad, and they need help getting people out before the whole thing comes down." Talon didn't hesitate. "I'll get my horse." "Talon, wait," Clara started, but he was already pulling on his boots and grabbing his coat. "I have to go, Clara. People need help." "I know, but..." She wanted to tell him to be careful, to come back safe, to remember he had a family now who needed him. But she saw the determination in his face and knew nothing she said would stop him from doing what he thought was right. So instead, she just nodded. "Go. Do what needs doing. We'll be here when you get back." He kissed her hard and fast, then touched Daniel's head with gentle fingers. "Keep him safe. Always." Then he was gone, disappearing into the storm with the young messenger. Clara stood in the doorway watching until the darkness swallowed them completely, then closed the door and carried Daniel back to the nursery. She tried to sleep but couldn't, too aware of Talon's absence and too worried about what might be happening at the Miller place. Instead, she rocked Daniel and waited, listening to the storm rage outside and praying that when morning came, Talon would be walking back through that door. The hours crawled past with agonizing slowness. Daniel finally fell back asleep, and Clara laid him in his cradle before moving to the window to watch for any sign of Talon's return. The rain had slowed to a steady drizzle, and the first gray light of dawn was beginning to creep across the sky when she finally saw movement on the road. Talon rode into the yard looking exhausted and filthy, soot staining his clothes and face. But he was whole, unhurt, and Clara felt relief crash over her so powerfully it made her knees weak. She met him at the door and he pulled her into his arms without a word, holding her tight enough that she could feel his heart racing against her chest. "Is everyone all right?" she asked. "Samuel broke his leg when the roof beam came down on him, but Doc Merritt thinks he'll heal fine. We got everyone out before the whole barn collapsed, saved most of the livestock too." Talon pulled back enough to meet her eyes. "I'm sorry I left you alone with Daniel." "You did what needed doing. That's who you are, Talon. That's one of the reasons I love you." He searched her face, looking for signs that she was just saying what he wanted to hear, but Clara meant every word. She'd married a man who ran toward danger when people needed help, who put aside his own safety to protect others, who'd spent his whole life being judged and rejected but still chose to be better than the people who'd hurt him. "Come inside," she said gently. "Get cleaned up and get some rest. Daniel and I will still be here when you wake up." Talon nodded, his exhaustion finally catching up with him. Clara helped him out of his filthy clothes and into bed, and within minutes he was asleep, one hand reaching across the mattress like even in sleep he needed to know she was there. Clara stood looking down at him, this complicated man who'd become her everything, and felt a fierce gratitude for the stubborn pride that had led her to chase him across half a territory in winter. They'd almost lost each other, almost let fear and misunderstanding destroy what they were building, but they'd fought their way back. And now they had Daniel and a home and a future that belonged entirely to them. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and new. And Clara Greyhawk, standing in the doorway between her sleeping husband and her sleeping son, felt like she'd finally found the place where she was meant to be. The fire at the Miller place changed something fundamental in how Red Mesa saw Talon Greyhawk. Word spread quickly through town about how he'd ridden into the burning barn without hesitation, how he'd helped pull Samuel Griggs from beneath a fallen beam while flames licked at the walls around them, how he'd worked alongside the other men until dawn to save what could be saved. By the time Talon woke that afternoon, still exhausted but driven by responsibility to check on Samuel, he found the town's attitude toward him had shifted in ways he hadn't expected. Men who'd previously crossed the street to avoid him now nodded in greeting. Women who'd whispered about Clara behind their hands now asked after the baby with what seemed like genuine interest. Even Mrs. Crenshaw, when Talon passed her outside the mercantile, offered a stiff but unmistakable thank you for helping save her nephew's family. "Don't let it go to your head," Samuel told him later that day, his broken leg splinted and propped up in Doc Merritt's office. One heroic act doesn't erase years of prejudice. But it's a start. People are starting to see you as one of them instead of separate from them. "I didn't do it to change their minds," Talon said honestly. "I did it because it needed doing." "I know, that's probably why it worked." Samuel grimaced as he shifted his leg. "You're a good man, Greyhawk, better than most. Took me too long to see it, but I see it now, and I'm grateful, both for the help and for giving this town a chance to be better than we've been." Talon didn't know what to say to that, so he just clasped Samuel's shoulder and promised to check on him again soon. On his way home, he stopped at the mercantile to buy supplies and found himself in conversation with 3 different men about rebuilding the Miller barn, about the best way to fireproof structures, about whether the town should invest in better equipment for fighting fires. They talked to him like an equal, like someone whose opinion mattered, and Talon felt the last of his defensive walls begin to crack. When he got home, Clara was in the garden with Daniel sleeping in a basket beside her, pulling weeds from the vegetable patch they'd planted together. She looked up when she heard his horse and smiled, and Talon felt his chest tighten with how much he loved this simple domestic scene. His wife working the land, his son safe and peaceful, the house they'd built together solid behind them. "How's Samuel?" Clara asked, wiping dirt from her hands. "Grumpy about being laid up, but he'll heal." Talon dismounted and came to stand beside her, looking down at Daniel's sleeping face. "The town's different today. People are actually talking to me." "They're finally seeing what I've always seen." Clara stood and kissed him softly. Took them long enough. Over the following weeks, the shift in the town's attitude accelerated. Families who'd withdrawn their children from Clara's school began asking when she planned to reopen. The banker who'd once threatened to seize her property now discussed terms for a small loan to expand the school building, acknowledging that Red Mesa needed a good teacher more than it needed another foreclosed property. Even the minister, who'd never officially condemned Clara and Talon, but had never supported them either, stopped by one Sunday afternoon to welcome them to services if they ever felt inclined to attend. "We don't have to go," Clara told Talon after the minister left. "I know organized religion hasn't always been kind to people like us." "Maybe we will sometime," Talon said, surprising himself. "Not because we need their approval, but because Daniel should know all his options. Let him decide for himself what he believes and where he belongs." Clara studied his face. "You've changed since he was born. Opened up in ways I didn't expect." "Fatherhood will do that, I guess. Makes you think about the future differently. About what kind of world you want to leave behind." Talon picked up Daniel, who'd just woken and was making the small noises that meant he'd be crying soon if someone didn't tend to him. "I spent so long just trying to survive that I forgot what it meant to actually live. You taught me that, Clara. You and this little one." The spring deepened into summer, and with it came the gradual establishment of a new normal. Clara reopened the school in June with 8 students, then 12, then 15, as word spread that she was teaching again. She hired a young woman from a neighboring town to help with the younger children, giving herself time to still be home with Daniel during his afternoon naps. Talon expanded their horse operation, buying 3 mares and a stallion, and beginning to breed animals that quickly gained a reputation for intelligence and endurance. They worked hard, but they also made time for joy. Evening walks with Daniel in a sling against Talon's chest, teaching him Apache words for the things they passed: mountain, sky, horse, home. Sunday picnics by the creek where Clara would read while Talon showed Daniel how water moved over stones. Quiet nights on the porch after the baby slept, talking about dreams and fears and the 1,000 small details that made up a shared life. One evening in late July, as they sat watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, Clara brought up something she'd been thinking about for weeks. "I want to expand the school," she said. "Not just more students, but a different kind of teaching. I want to offer classes for adults too, reading and writing for those who never had the chance to learn, English lessons for the Apache families who are trying to navigate a world that demands they speak a language not their own." Talon looked at her with surprise and something that might have been pride. "That's ambitious. The town might not like it." "The town doesn't have to like it. They just have to allow it. And I think after everything that's happened, after they've seen what we've built here, they might be willing to give it a chance." Clara reached for his hand. "I want Daniel to grow up seeing his parents break down barriers, not just accept them. I want him to know that change is possible, even in places that seem stuck in their ways." "Then we'll make it happen," Talon said simply. "Whatever you need, whatever it takes. I'm with you." They started small, offering evening classes twice a week in the schoolhouse. The first night, only 3 people showed up: 2 Apache women who wanted to learn to read English, and an older white man who'd never been taught his letters. By the 3rd week, attendance had grown to 10. By the end of summer, Clara had a waiting list. The classes brought people together in ways Clara hadn't anticipated. The Apache women taught the white students about traditional medicine and storytelling. The white students shared their knowledge of navigating legal documents and town politics. Talon began attending to help translate and found himself becoming a bridge between 2 communities that had existed side by side but separate for so long. Not everyone approved. Mrs. Crenshaw made her displeasure known loudly and often, arguing that mixing cultures would lead to moral degradation and the loss of proper values. A few families withdrew their children from the day school in protest, but for every person who objected, 2 more stepped forward in support, and Clara learned to measure success not by universal approval, but by the slow, steady progress of minds opening and barriers falling. In September, on Daniel's 6-month birthday, Doc Merritt declared him completely healthy and thriving. The fear that had shadowed Clara since his early birth finally lifted, replaced by confidence that her son would not just survive but flourish. That night, she and Talon celebrated quietly at home, drinking wine on the porch while Daniel slept inside. "I keep waiting for something to go wrong," Clara admitted, "for the other shoe to drop. We've been happy for months now, and happiness still feels fragile to me, like something I'm not allowed to trust." "I know what you mean." Talon refilled her glass. "I wake up some mornings and think this must be a dream, that I'll open my eyes and be back in that mining camp alone, or worse, back in the moment when I signed those divorce papers and walked away from you. But then I hear Daniel crying or smell your coffee brewing, and I remember this is real. We made this, Clara. We fought for it and earned it, and that makes it solid, trustworthy." "You really believe that?" "I do, and I think eventually you will too." Clara wanted to believe him, wanted to let go of the anxiety that still sometimes gripped her in the quiet moments. But she was learning that healing from old wounds took time, that you couldn't rush the process of learning to trust in good things after a lifetime of bracing for loss. October brought the first frost, and with it an unexpected visitor. Clara was teaching her afternoon class when a woman appeared in the doorway, tall and elegant, with silver streaking her dark hair and eyes that held a familiar intensity. It took Clara a moment to place her, and when she did, surprise made her pause mid-sentence. Celine Vance looked older than Clara remembered, the hard edges softened by something that might have been peace or resignation. She waited until the class ended and the students filed out, then approached Clara with the careful courtesy of someone who knew they might not be welcome. "Mrs. Greyhawk," Celine said, "I hope I'm not intruding." "Celine." Clara set down her chalk and tried to read the other woman's expression, This is unexpected. I imagine it is. I'm passing through on my way to California and wanted to stop, to see how things turned out for you and Talon. If that's all right. Clara considered refusing, sending Celine on her way without the satisfaction of seeing what she'd once tried to destroy. But curiosity and something that might have been compassion won out. Would you like some coffee? We can talk at the house. They walked in silence to the small house Clara and Talon had transformed from a lonely dwelling into a home. Daniel was awake in his cradle, making happy nonsense sounds, and Celine stopped in the doorway when she saw him. "That's your son," she said softly. "That's Daniel. He'll be 7 months old next week." Clara lifted him from the cradle and settled him on her hip, watching Celine's face carefully. "He's beautiful. Looks like his father. He has Talon's eyes." Clara carried Daniel to the kitchen and poured coffee one-handed with the practiced efficiency of a mother who'd learned to do everything while holding a baby. "What brings you to Red Mesa, Celine? Really?" Celine accepted the coffee and sat at the table, her gaze distant. "Closure, I suppose. I left Montana with a lot of regrets about how I'd handled things with you and Talon. I told myself I was trying to reclaim something I'd lost, but the truth is, I was trying to run from my own failures by attaching myself to his. When I saw you and Helena, pregnant and desperate, I realized what a fool I'd been. I wanted to tell you I'm sorry for stirring up trouble in Red Mesa, for making you doubt Talon's feelings, for being so caught up in my own pain that I couldn't see I was causing yours." Clara sat across from her, Daniel reaching for her coffee cup with grabby hands. "I'm not going to lie and say it didn't hurt. It did. You came into our lives at exactly the moment when we were most vulnerable, and your presence nearly destroyed us. I know. But we survived it, and in some strange way, maybe we needed that test. Needed to break apart completely before we could figure out how to put ourselves back together the right way." Clara looked down at Daniel, who was now trying to eat her sleeve. "So I forgive you, Celine, not because what you did was right, but because holding on to anger won't serve me or my family." Celine's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Thank you. That's more grace than I deserve. We all deserve grace. We all make mistakes and hurt people and carry regrets. The question is what we do with that knowledge." Clara met Celine's gaze directly. "What are you doing with yours?" "I'm trying to be better. I found work in San Francisco helping women who are in situations like the ones I used to be in, women running from bad choices, looking for second chances. It doesn't erase what I've done, but it helps me feel like I'm contributing something positive to the world." They talked for another hour, the conversation gradually shifting from painful history to present hopes and future plans. When Celine finally stood to leave, she paused at the door and looked back at Clara with something like wonder. "You have everything I thought I wanted, the husband, the child, the home. But seeing it now, I realize I never really wanted those things for themselves. I just wanted to feel like I belonged somewhere, like I mattered to someone. I was looking for that in Talon because I didn't know how to find it in myself." "And now?" Clara asked. "Now I'm learning. Slowly. But I'm learning." Celine smiled, and it looked genuine. "Take care of them, Clara. Take care of each other." "We will." After Celine left, Clara stood on the porch with Daniel in her arms and watched the other woman disappear down the road. She felt lighter somehow, as if forgiving Celine had also freed something in herself, the last remnants of insecurity about whether Talon had truly chosen her, whether their love was truly solid. When Talon came home that evening, she told him about Celine's visit. He listened quietly, his expression thoughtful. "How do you feel about seeing her again?" he asked. "At peace," Clara said, surprising herself with how true it was. "I think I needed to see that she was just a person carrying her own pain, not some threat to what we've built. And I think she needed to see that we made it, that love can survive even when it gets tested." Talon pulled her close, Daniel squished happily between them. "We did more than survive. We thrived, and we're going to keep thriving, Clara. I promise you that." The winter that followed was the best either of them could remember. Heavy snows blanketed the valley, turning Red Mesa into a white-wrapped world of stark beauty. Clara's school had to close for a few weeks when the weather made travel impossible, but she used the time to read by the fire with Daniel in her lap, teaching him to recognize letters, even though he was far too young to understand. Talon worked in the barn, training the horses and making plans for spring expansion. They celebrated Daniel's first birthday in February with a small gathering of friends: Doc Merritt, Samuel Griggs, and his wife, a few families from the school. It was a modest affair, but the warmth of genuine friendship filled the house in a way that made Clara's eyes sting with grateful tears. Daniel ate cake with his hands and got it everywhere, laughing with pure toddler joy, and Clara looked around the room at the community they'd built and felt something settle permanently in her chest. This was belonging. This was home. In March, Clara discovered she was pregnant again. The news brought a complex swirl of emotions: joy at the prospect of expanding their family, fear of another difficult pregnancy, excitement about giving Daniel a sibling. When she told Talon, he swept her into his arms and spun her around, laughing like she'd never heard him laugh before. "Another baby," he said, his voice full of wonder. "Another chance to get it right from the start." "We got it right with Daniel," Clara corrected, "even if the beginning was hard." "Fair enough. Another chance to get it right, and also get to enjoy every moment without being terrified we're going to lose each other." He set her down gently, his hand moving to her still flat stomach. "Boy or girl, this one's going to be so loved." "They're going to be so spoiled," Clara said. "Between us and Doc Merritt and half the town, this baby won't want for anything." The pregnancy progressed smoothly this time, without the complications that had marked Daniel's early arrival. Clara taught through her first trimester despite morning sickness, then scaled back her hours as summer approached and her belly grew. Talon hired help for the heavy work around the property, refusing to let Clara overexert herself. And Daniel, now a toddler with his father's determination and his mother's curiosity, became fascinated with the idea of a sibling. "Baby?" he'd say, patting Clara's stomach. "My baby." "Our baby," Clara would correct gently. "You're going to be a big brother." Daniel seemed to like the sound of that, repeating "bro-ver" with toddler pride. In October, exactly 2 years after Celine's visit, Clara went into labor on a crisp autumn morning that smelled of wood smoke and fallen leaves. This time, there was no panic, no premature rush. Talon sent for Doc Merritt calmly, settled Clara comfortably, and kept Daniel entertained while they waited for the contractions to progress. The labor was long but manageable, and when their daughter finally entered the world just after midnight, she came with a full-throated cry that announced her presence unmistakably. "A girl," Doc Merritt said, handing the baby to Clara. "Healthy lungs, good color, perfect in every way." Clara looked down at her daughter, smaller than Daniel had been but vigorous and alert, and felt her heart expand to accommodate this new love. The baby had Talon's dark hair but Clara's lighter eyes, a perfect blend of both their heritages. "What should we call her?" Talon asked, sitting on the bed beside them. They discussed names for months without settling on one, wanting to see the baby before deciding. Now, looking at her daughter's face, Clara knew exactly what felt right. "Rose," she said, "for new beginnings, for things that grow beautiful even in harsh conditions." "Rose Greyhawk," Talon tested, then smiled. "Perfect." Daniel was allowed in to meet his sister the next morning, and his reaction was everything Clara had hoped for. He approached the baby with careful curiosity, touching her tiny hand with one chubby finger. "Gentle," Claire reminded him. "Gentoul," Daniel repeated solemnly. "My baby Rose." Over the next months, their family settled into new rhythms. Daniel proved to be a surprisingly helpful big brother, fetching diapers and blankets and singing to Rose when she cried. Talon juggled horse training with night feedings and diaper changes, never complaining about the exhaustion. Clara learned to navigate the particular chaos of caring for 2 children while still maintaining her connection to the school, now permanently run by the young woman she'd hired and 2 additional teachers. The expansion Clara had dreamed of became reality. The school offered day classes for children and evening classes for adults, taught reading and writing and mathematics alongside Apache cultural lessons and English language instruction. It became a true community center, a place where people from different backgrounds learned to see each other as neighbors rather than strangers. Red Mesa itself continued to evolve. The prejudice that had once defined the town didn't disappear completely. Some people would always carry their fear of difference, But it diminished enough that Apache families began settling closer to town rather than keeping to the distant margins. Mixed families like the Greyhawks were no longer unique oddities, but part of the town's growing diversity. On a warm spring evening when Daniel was 4 and Rose was 18 months old, Clara and Talon sat on their porch watching their children chase fireflies in the yard. Rose toddled after her brother with determined steps, laughing when she caught the light between her small hands. Daniel showed her gently how to release the fireflies, teaching her the same careful kindness his parents had modeled for him. "Do you ever think about how close we came to losing all this?" Clara asked quietly. "Sometimes," Talon admitted. "Usually late at night when I can't sleep and my mind wants to torture me with what-ifs. What if you'd never come to Montana? What if I'd been too proud to come back? What if—" "But we did," Clara interrupted gently. "We found each other, we fought for each other, and we built this. The what-ifs don't matter as much as what actually is." "You're right." Talon reached for her hand, lacing their fingers together in the gesture that had become their anchor. "I spent so many years believing I didn't deserve happiness, that good things weren't meant for people like me. You taught me I was wrong about that." "We taught each other," Clara said. "I was just as convinced I'd end up alone. That love was something that happened to other people, but never to me. We were both wrong, and thank everything we figured it out before it was too late." They sat in comfortable silence, watching their children play, listening to the evening sounds of horses in the barn and wind in the cottonwoods. The house behind them was filled with the accumulated evidence of their shared life: Daniel's toys, Rose's blankets, books, and clothes and dishes, the thousand small objects that transformed a structure into a home. Inside, hanging above the fireplace, was the divorce decree they'd never finalized. Talon had framed it as a reminder of how close they'd come to destroying their own happiness, and Clara had agreed. Sometimes it was important to remember how fragile good things could be, how much work it took to build something worth keeping. But they'd done that work. Every day, in small ways and large ones, they chose each other and chose this life they were building together. And that choice, made again and again with full knowledge of the cost and the reward, was what transformed a marriage of convenience into something that would endure. "Mama," Rose called from the yard, holding up her hands full of captured light. "Look!" "I see, sweetheart," Clara called back. "Beautiful." Talon squeezed her hand. "She's right, you know. It is beautiful, all of it." Clara looked at her husband, this man who'd offered her his name when she had nothing left, who'd learned to stay when every instinct told him to run, who'd chosen love even when it terrified him, and felt gratitude so intense it threatened to overwhelm her. "Yes," she whispered. "It really is." Years passed, marked by the ordinary miracles of family life. Daniel started school and excelled, his quick mind and bilingual fluency making him a bridge between different groups of students. Rose followed 3 years later, shy at first, but blossoming under her brother's protection. Talon's horse operation grew into one of the most respected in the territory, and he began training young men, both Apache and white, in the art of working with horses, passing on knowledge his mother had taught him. Clara's school became a model for other frontier towns, and she was occasionally asked to travel and speak about her methods for integrating different communities through education. She always declined, unwilling to leave her family for extended periods, but she wrote articles and shared her curriculum freely with anyone who asked. The town continued to change around them. Red Mesa grew from a rough frontier settlement into something approaching civilization, not the kind that erased difference or demanded conformity, but the kind that made room for multiple ways of being. It wasn't perfect. There were still conflicts, still people who clung to old prejudices, still moments when Clara or Talon faced discrimination that reminded them how much work remained. But there was progress too, real, measurable progress that showed in the faces of children growing up without the rigid divisions that had defined their parents' generation. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Talon surprised Clara with a renewal ceremony. He'd enlisted Doc Merritt and Samuel Griggs to help plan it, and on a beautiful June morning they stood before their friends and family, Apache and white, old and young, the whole community they'd helped build, and spoke new vows. 10 years ago, I married you out of desperation and convenience, Clara said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. I needed protection, and you offered it without asking for anything in return. But somewhere between that cold transaction and today, I fell completely and irrevocably in love with you. You taught me that strength isn't about never needing help. It's about accepting it when it's offered. You showed me that love doesn't require perfection, just commitment to keep choosing each other even when it's hard. So today, I'm choosing you again, Talon Greyhawk. Not because I need to, but because I want to. Because a life with you is the only life I want to live. Talon's voice was rough with emotion when he responded. I gave you my name thinking it would be temporary, a legal shield that would protect your property until you found someone better. I never imagined you'd become my whole world. You taught me that I deserve love, that my heritage is something to celebrate rather than hide, that staying is braver than running. You gave me children who will never have to choose between who they are and who the world wants them to be. You gave me a home, Clara. Not just this house, but a place to belong in a world that spent my whole life telling me I didn't fit. So I'm choosing you again too, for the rest of my life, for whatever comes next, I'm choosing you. Daniel and Rose stood beside them as witnesses, now 10 and 7 years old respectively, solemn with the weight of the moment. When Talon and Clara kissed to seal their renewed vows, both children cheered, and the gathered crowd erupted in applause and celebration. The party that followed lasted until sunset, filled with food and music and dancing. Clara watched Talon spin Rose around while Daniel tried to teach Doc Merritt an Apache dance he'd learned from his father, and felt a contentment so complete it brought fresh tears to her eyes. You've built something remarkable here, Samuel Griggs said, appearing at her elbow with 2 glasses of punch. Not just a family, though that's remarkable enough, but a whole new way of living that proves people from different worlds can not just coexist but thrive together. We just lived our lives, Clara said. We didn't set out to prove anything. Maybe that's why it worked. You weren't trying to make a statement, you were just trying to survive and then to be happy. But other people watched and learned from it anyway. Samuel raised his glass. To 10 more years, and 10 more after that. Clara clinked her glass against his and drank, watching the sun set over the mountains and paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere in the crowd, Talon caught her eye and smiled, and Clara felt the same flutter in her chest she'd felt that first time he'd stayed for dinner, when she'd realized this arrangement might become something neither of them had planned for. It had become everything. That night, after the guests had gone and the children were asleep, Clara and Talon sat together on their porch one more time. It had become their ritual, this quiet communion at the end of each day, and neither of them had any intention of breaking it. Do you remember the first time we sat here together? Clara asked. After we got married the first time, when everything was still awkward and uncertain. Talon pulled her closer. I remember thinking you were the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen, and also the most terrifying because you made me feel things I'd convinced myself I'd never feel. I was terrified too. Of you, of the situation, of how much power you suddenly had over my future. And now? Now I'm still a little terrified sometimes, Clara admitted, but it's a different kind of fear. Not of you leaving or hurting me, but of how much I have to lose. You and the children, you're everything. The thought of losing any of you is almost unbearable. Then we'll just have to make sure we stick around, Talon said lightly, but Clara heard the seriousness underneath. We've survived everything else life threw at us. We can survive whatever comes next, too. Clara leaned her head on his shoulder and looked out at the land they'd fought so hard to keep, the land that had become the foundation of everything they'd built, the house her father had constructed with his own hands, the school where she taught children to see beyond the limitations others tried to impose, the barn where Talon trained horses and young men alike, the garden where vegetables grew alongside wildflowers, cultivated and wild existing in harmony. All of it, every piece, every person, every hard-won victory, was proof that love could transform everything. That 2 people desperate and alone could find each other and build something that would outlast them both. I love you, she said simply. I love you too, Talon replied. Always have. Always will. They sat together as the stars emerged one by one, holding hands in the darkness, and Clara thought about the girl she'd been when she first signed her name beside Talon's. That girl had been looking for safety, for a way to survive what seemed like an impossible situation. She'd found that, but she'd also found so much more. She'd found a partner who would fight beside her, a man who would father her children with tenderness and teach them to honor all the parts of themselves. a love that had been tested and refined until it was strong enough to build a life on. And in the end, that was what mattered. Not how it started, but how they'd chosen to continue. Not the arrangement they'd made out of desperation, but the life they'd created from it. The silent vow they'd made to each other in that cold courthouse had become a promise spoken aloud every day, not in words, but in actions. In the way Talon still brought her coffee exactly how she liked it every morning. In the way Clara still mended his shirts even though they could afford to buy new ones. In the thousand small kindnesses that wove their lives together into something unbreakable. Inside the house, Rose cried out in her sleep, and Talon started to rise, but Clara touched his arm. "I'll go," she said. "You've been up the last 3 nights." "We'll both go," Talon decided. "Together." And so they did, walking into their home hand in hand, ready to comfort their daughter, and then return to their own bed, to the life they'd built from nothing and desperation and a marriage that was supposed to be temporary. It had become permanent in every way that mattered. It had become everything they'd never dared to hope for. It had become, against all odds and expectations, the greatest love story either of them would ever know. And as Clara tucked Rose back into bed and watched Talon kiss their daughter's forehead with infinite gentleness, she knew with absolute certainty that this was exactly where she was meant to be. Not because fate or destiny had brought her here, but because she and Talon had chosen this, chosen each other. Chosen love over fear, hope over cynicism, staying over running. They had chosen wisely. The rest, the joy, the family, the community, the life that made every hard moment worth enduring, was simply the reward for having the courage to fight for what mattered most. And they would keep fighting, keep choosing, keep building until their last breath. Because that's what love was. Not a feeling that came and went, but a decision made fresh every morning to honor the vows they'd spoken and the life they'd created. Silent no more. Their love had found its voice, and it sang through every corner of the home they'd made, every heart they'd touched, every life they'd changed simply by refusing to accept the limitations the world tried to impose. Clara Greyhawk nay. Whitmore stood in the nursery doorway watching her husband with their daughter and felt peace settle over her like a benediction. The girl who'd signed those papers in desperation was gone, transformed into a woman who knew her own strength and worth. The man who'd offered his name without hope had become a father and husband who chose love every day. Together, they'd built something that would endure long after they were gone. A family, a community, a legacy of choosing compassion over prejudice and love over fear. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything.